Dr. Vibodh Parthasarthi. He maintains a multidisciplinary interest in media policy and creative industries. His most recent work being the edited double volume, The Indian Media Economy, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. Parthasarthi has been at the forefront of media policy research in India and a winner of numerous grants, including from the Ford Foundation, Canada's IDRC, SSRC, India-New Zealand Education Council, and Open Society Foundation. Currently, on extraordinary leave from Jamia Millia Islamia, his recent visiting positions include at the University of Queensland, at KU Leuven, and at IIT Bombay, besides being invited in affiliate positions by CMDS at Central European University. Parthasarthi has been invited to board or equivalent positions at the Center for Internet and Society and the Media Foundation. He also serves in editorial advisory roles at MIT Press, Oxford University Press, and The Conversation. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I think this one should be fine, right? Yeah. Thanks very much for having me here. The last day, so you guys must be completely at the end of the curve. Yeah. And on top of that, I have 2 sessions, so you'll have to sort of see me twice today. I hope I don't really stress you out too much on that. Yeah. I sort of work, just one slide a bit on myself. I work in the area of media studies, which is a subfield of a larger area called communication studies. Yeah. My research interests are primarily in regulation, but because of regulation, I also study media businesses. Yeah. And I really don't think one can do one without the other. I follow 2 broad approaches. One, of course, is policy analysis, which is the more default approach in my research area. I also do something called historical reconstruction, which is trying to look at the past in light of the way it has sort of emerged today. In terms of research frameworks, institutionalism is something which I look at, which is again the default field of policy studies. But I also have a much older leaning towards political economy. So in terms of real traditional disciplines, my work would lie somewhere between economic sociology, which is a little bit sort of underdeveloped in this part of the world, and business history, which is, of course, is relatively developed in this part of the world thanks to the work at IIM Ahmedabad there. I have 3 kind of ongoing areas of research here. One is this whole idea of the market. What does the market mean? We use the word market nearly every day, you know. But what does it really mean as far as media studies is concerned? So that's more theoretical kind of research in there. I'm interested at the analytical level on the idea of media power. We talk a lot about media, we talk a lot about power, but very often we don't talk about them together. So what do we mean by media power? We see a lot of it around, especially over the last 10 years or so, but what does media power mean? So that's something which I'm interested in. And the last part of my interest, in a sense, which is the focus of today's 2 sessions, is on the idea of the digital turn. This kind of phrase is extremely common if you try and look at keyword searches and so on and so forth over the last 10 years. You'll keep on talking about the phrase digital turn. So what does that really turn mean? Yeah. I'll talk some parts of that as I go through the talk here. The idea of the digital in itself, and again, you would have heard like, I don't know, 14 days of this right now, so you must have heard 28 versions at least of this by now. Okay, I'll add the 29th version of it. Yeah. So of course, traditionally, the idea of the digital is connected with the idea of technology and the way in which changes in technology have changed the way in which information gets transmitted, stored, and so on and so forth. Yeah. There are 3 other aspects to this which I think is equally important. One, of course, is the infrastructure issue. So the way in which digital infrastructure is expanding and reformulating current infrastructures here. So that's the second part important. The third part, of course, is the whole idea of interests here. So with different kinds of turn in society and polity, there are also opportunities for newer kind of interest to emerge here. So one of my key quests is to try and figure out what are these new interests which have emerged post the digital turn, and how do they interact with pre-existing interests here? And lastly, the digital turn also has implications on institutions here. The way institutions respond to the idea of the turn, the way the institutions perhaps trigger off the digital turn, and of course, the way in which institutions tend to reorganize themselves, both internally and vis-a-vis other kind of institutions following the digital turn. Yeah. So this is the kind of schema I tend to work with when we are talking about media in general, the digital turn in particular, or regulation in super particular. These are kind of four quadrants I tend to focus on here. Most research on media is largely at the level of information. But that's what we see the most, we consume the most, we create the most as well. And somehow in terms of research, the other three sort of touch points, institutions, interests, and infrastructures, tend to get left out here. And these are primarily most important as far as regulation is concerned here. Because regulation has to do with all these four ideas, the regulation of information, of institutions, of interests, and infrastructures. And as I go down this line, I'll try and point out ways in which this becomes a little bit more apparent here. So the digital turn, of course, has also created new vocabulary. All sort of turns in the social sciences create their own vocabulary. These are the most common terms which one sees in literature, the whole idea of digital migration. So you're moving from one system to another system, which is highly contested, and I'll try and bring that up as well. And the whole idea of digital dividend, that we benefit, we get something above and beyond when we follow the digital turn. Yeah. So this is just purely in terms of background. Yeah. What does digitalization mean? And that, in a sense, is an important issue. What are its various playing fields? Yeah. And I'll set the context up a little bit in terms of my specific talk here. Yeah. Clearly, it means something to do with the changes in which news gets produced and distributed. Yeah. So at one level, of course, the digital turn is hinting at the way in which the news landscape as a whole is getting changed. And of course, everybody who uses different kinds of digital tools would be aware of that. Yeah. It, of course, also deals with the way in which pre-existing forms of producing and disseminating news, especially broadcast television, also underwent a certain kind of change. And of course, more specifically, the most common form of television all of us tend to consume is cable. And there have been significant changes post the digital turn as far as the cable industry is concerned. One quick show of hands here, how many people use a phone? How many of you who are smart enough to use a smartphone? That's a half a hand there, actually. Yeah. Okay. So everybody is, you don't use a smartphone. Okay. So everybody is smart in this room and everybody uses a smartphone. Yeah. Okay. How many of you watch television on your smartphone? Okay. So that's good. And how many of you have laptops here? Oh. With a mobile chip in it or without a mobile chip? Oh. So do you have a SIM card in your laptop? Okay. So nobody has a SIM card in. So you deal with television, then you have your phone where you have a SIM card, and then you have your laptop where you don't have a SIM card. So you use a lot of devices, and this must be really difficult on all of you to manage. Yeah. I'll come to why that later on as well. Yeah. As far as, of course, specifically newspapers are concerned, again, there has been this shift from newspapers, as in paper newspapers, to digital newspapers. Yeah. And there goes my second question in terms of how often do all of you read actually a newspaper, like the paper? Okay, that's the hand suddenly just come down. Yeah. Okay. So that's something which the newspapers are trying to manage in terms of the fact that because the hands are very low on those who use newspapers, how should newspapers try and survive in this particular environment? And there is a big kind of debate around both within newspapers and even outside that. Yeah. So that's another playing field of the digital turn. Um, there has been some interest over the last 7, 8 years as well in terms of social media and news. And I guess in this case, all your hands would be up, those of you who are on social media. Facebook, how many of you are on Facebook? And Twitter? Both hands if you are on both? Oh, wow, okay. So I'll put both my hands down on this one actually, yeah, because I'm on neither. But there is this concern, of course, besides the social part of it, that are large parts of social media actually replacing or complementing or enhancing existing ways in which news gets produced? What does it do to news itself? What does it do to journalism as a profession? And of course, what does it do to journalists as people who make an income out of this? The other playing fields of the digital turn, of course, is something which many of us are familiar with in a different way, is of course the whole cinema business. The cinema business perhaps was amongst the earliest ones to undergo a digital transition. Okay? So in many cases, for example, in cinema halls right now, in the larger ones, especially in multiplexes, you really don't have film being screened there. You have signals coming from one place into the theater and then gets beamed across. So it's in a sense, it's film without film per se. And that in a sense has really reorganized the way in which cinema gets produced and consumed. And of course, the last playing field in this case, the most common one is the idea of digitized music. And again, this is something where all your phones and other devices come into use. We are in an environment where the organization of music, in a sense, has fundamentally altered from devices outside the phone to devices again inside the phone and other portable devices. There is also a digital turn outside the field of the media, which again is important because it has implications on the way in which the media functions. Two examples I'll give right now. One, of course, is something you're all familiar with, the whole idea of digitizing your identity here. How many of you have Aadhaar cards? I won't complain if you don't, but nearly everybody has an Aadhaar card. So that's highly compliant of all of you. So this is a way in which, one way in which, in a sense, our identity gets digitized here. Okay? It exists outside us in a form which is identifiable here. In a form which is, in that sense, disembodied. This would have been a word you would have heard over the last 2 weeks. It also concerns with the way in which identities tend to get enclosed, okay, and therefore visible there. So all of you who have Aadhaar cards are perhaps much more visible to those who manage these digital systems than they were otherwise. And of course, this was the other way in which the digital turn unfolded in India. In terms of the way in which cash, again, something which is paper, like a newspaper, got converted into something which was disembodied there. How many of you use digital currency? Debit cards, credit cards, phone? Okay, so reasonable number of hands there. So we are relatively digitized in that sense, which means there's a good selection of people actually who have come here. They are all digitized or on the way towards that. The interesting thing about cash, again, it reflects this whole idea of enclosure and visibility. Those who are digitized in terms of their financial transactions are more or less enclosed within certain kind of systems. Okay? And again, you're visible. So most transactions that you make using digital forms of exchange are visible, traceable, and so on and so forth. So there is this pretty close connection between the idea of enclosure and visibility as far as the digital turn itself is concerned there. Some keywords, and I'm now coming to the sort of core area of what I'm going to talk about today. 3 keywords, 2 of them are very common. The third one is perhaps less common, and I'll try and expand that so that we know that we are talking in a common kind of language here. So policy, that's a word which is being used more and more commonly. It's also become an area of academic interest. I mean, there are programs in policy studies, social policy, and so on and so forth over the last 10 years in universities. The way I see it, policy, without going into the debate, this is purely my take to sort of cut it short. Policy essentially concerns the distribution of power in society. So if it's dealing with an organization which has a particular kind of policy, or the state which has meta-level policies, essentially it's visualizing a distribution and a redistribution of power. Okay? And in this process of redistribution of power, certain values are evoked. Okay? And those values then tend to convey intent. So there is this relationship between the idea of power, values, and intent. And very often, of course, these values tend to justify the intent. And of course, the values are also used to justify a certain kind of redistribution of power. And that's why in policy studies, the phrase used is policy values. For reading of a particular kind of policy document, what values does it stand for becomes much more important than what it actually is trying to do, and so on and so forth. And this is something which is often left out here. We read policy documents largely in terms of intent. That's the first level of reading. But perhaps it becomes important to try and see what's underlying that intent. What values does a particular policy document, policy resolution actually stand for? The second phrase, which I'll use quite often, is the idea of regulation. And there again, beginning from simplistic ideas of understanding policy, a very simplistic idea of regulation would essentially mean the operationalization of those policy values, or the translation of intent into certain kind of mechanisms. Okay, that's a kind of mechanist sort of approach towards policy. What tends to happen, of course, is if we assume that policy concerns the distribution of power, which is based upon certain kind of values, then we also know that these values are not neutral. Values tend to confront both interests and institutions. And therefore, through that prism, the idea of regulation then becomes a bit more complicated. It's not only the translation of policy, it's not only the operationalization of policy values, but in this sense, regulation, and I'm using it in the singular, regulation essentially reflects a field of contest here. It represents a field of context over values, between interests, and the ways in which institutions tend to mediate these values and interests. That, in a sense, complicates the idea of what regulation is. It's a field of contest over decisions, what decisions ought to be taken, have been taken, and more importantly, a field of contest over the process of decision making. Very often, there is perhaps a consensus over a certain decision which is being taken, whether in an organization or at the state level. But what again gets left out is the process of decision making, because that very process also conveys certain kind of values and a preponderance of certain kind of interests. So regulation, again, I mean, those of you who are interested in, my plea would be to focus equally on decisions and the process through which those decisions have arrived. And this is something, again, significant to the way in which regulatory debates have been happening in India. The last term I'll use is the term called instruments. These are essentially mechanisms which derive their legitimacy from legal bodies of knowledge, from legislative mandates, and the way in which governments behave otherwise, which is largely through executive mechanisms. And therefore, in literature, you'll come across the term policy instruments or regulatory instruments, which are essentially mechanisms to realize those kinds of values, particular kind of values, and mechanisms through which the fields of contests are actually settled. I'll be using the word policy instruments as we go further down as well. So, in terms of the pitch, specifically the plea I'm trying to make here today, it's a thumbprint about this, that, so what's at stake in terms of what I'm trying to talk about right now? The idea here, in a sense, is to understand digital news making as a regulatory field here. So we're not looking specifically at the way in which digital news is regulated, but more to understand the way in which digital news has offered itself as a field of regulation. And therefore, what are the different mechanisms and different types of contests that emerge in the field of digital news? And that idea of looking at regulation in mechanist terms to more in terms of contests is perhaps the central claim I'm trying to make here. I'll do three things essentially over these 40, 50 slides till now. I'll try and unpack the idea of what is the regulatory environment here. This is I've had a long-standing debate with those who tend to argue that there is no real regulatory environment for news here, which at one level is, say, compared to environment and so on and so forth. Yeah. But there are two types of instruments which become important when we're talking about the regulatory environment of digital news. Yeah. One, of course, is something very visible, what we would call explicit instruments, explicit regulatory instruments. Yeah. So these are the kind of mechanisms, and I'll list them later on as I go by, which directly have an impact on the way in which news as information and as infrastructure tend to function. Yeah. So that's what we see, the explicit part of it. Yeah. There are also tangential instruments. Yeah. By tangential, I mean that these were instruments which were not primarily addressed towards news, but they also inadvertently, sometimes tangentially, affect the way in which news, information, and infrastructures tend to function. Yeah. I use the idea of the ripple effect here. Yeah. So these are mechanisms which were not addressed or provoked by the landscape of news. They were responding to other kind of anxieties. Yeah. But in responding to that, they also have an indirect ripple effect on the functioning of the news landscape. Yeah. That is again something which becomes analytically important when you're looking at regulation as a field. Yeah. But I'm also looking at the lack of instruments here. The so-called absence of regulatory intervention, and I've argued this elsewhere, is an equally important part of regulation. Yeah. So if regulation is an intervention in the news landscape, which stands for certain values and a certain kind of interests, then by that logic, non-regulation itself is a way in which the environment gets reshaped. Yeah. Okay, and there's been some recent literature on the whole idea of regulatory silences. Yeah. So you don't have regulation purely at the level of intervention, but also to try and understand non-intervention as a form of regulation. Yeah. The best analogy, in a sense, I tend to sort of share on this is the whole idea of looking at war. The history of war is perhaps also the history of the failure of peace. And the history of peace, in the other way, is also, in a sense, something intervened by the history of war. So to understand the reverse of it, why isn't there regulation at certain points of time where there ought to be? Again, gives us an idea of what is the nature of regulation. Because the nature of regulation for us is to understand what were the values, what are the interests, and how does it impact the way in which the news infrastructure tends to behave. This is perhaps a little bit more complex to try and understand what these regulatory silences are, but I will unpack that as I go forward into it. So three things to keep in mind. What are those mechanisms that explicitly and directly shape the way in which the news environment tends to function? So that's one example of that. So for instance, if there is an internet blockage, that clearly in a sense shapes the way in which news does not get circulated. So that's an explicit kind of instrument here. Okay? On the other hand, it's possible that there are more indirect, tangential, perhaps even unintended interventions, which might have an impact on the way in which news gets produced or circulated, which is an equally important part of understanding regulation. And of course, lastly, there are also ways in which lack of intervention by the government also shapes the way in which the news landscape, the behavior of journalists, the circulation of news, the production of news also gets impacted there. So to give this a kind of more sort of a kind of theoretical sort of frame, we are looking at actually three different ways in which the field of contest of regulation actually unfolds here. So we're looking at explicit instruments which are driven by a certain kind of a strategic intent. So there is an intent which is then operationalized through a very strategic instrument. We also have, in a sense, what I called earlier tangential mechanisms, something which is not specifically directed at news making or newsmakers, but has an indirect impact on that. And the phrase normally used here is the idea of sledgehammer. You know what a sledgehammer is? Sledgehammer is like a huge kind of hammer. You kind of bring it down. Yeah. So again, so the whole idea of a sledgehammer is not to address one particular particle, but to address an entire totality. Yeah. And in that totality, if news is also involved, it gets sort of affected by it. Yeah. And the third part, of course, of that is this whole idea of what I've been calling considered silence, also called regulatory silence, is whereby the state, in a sense, for reasons which perhaps I think are insidious, tends to take the path of forbearance, which essentially means that you don't get involved in regulating it. Okay? And that sense, that act of not getting involved, that act of not responding to a certain kind of change itself stands for certain kind of values and certain kinds of interests. Yeah. There is, of course, a kind of intellectual history for all these kind of terms. Yeah. So the whole idea, for example, of explicit mechanisms, what I'd call strategic intent, is essentially based upon traditional studies of what's called sectoral regulation. So there is one sector, whether it's newsmaking, whether it's environment, whether it's gender politics, whether it's water management. These are various sectors, and there are different mechanisms which respond with a very pinpointed intent in mind to try and frame the way in which that sector tends to function, as opposed to the sledgehammer approach, whereby broad multi-sectoral interventions take place, which then of course tend to affect different sectors in different ways. Yeah. And I'll give examples of this as I go down. And the third part, of course, is if you have strategic intent, then one can also argue a case for strategic silence. So if there is a strategy behind intent, then one could also argue that there is also a strategy behind non-intent, a strategy behind silence. And this, in a sense, has, in policy studies, this has been defined or conceptualized in the term of negative policy. So policy can be positive, but policy can also be negative in that sense of being silent. Yeah. Okay, I'll try and now sort of lay out the landscape a little bit more. This is sort of one map of the kind of quick show of hands which I did in this room. These figures, of course, not only change every month, but there is a big contest over the veracity of these figures as well. Yeah. Quite clearly, if you are a broadband service provider, you would like to show that your business is increasing, and therefore you will try and inflate the figures and so on and so forth. Yeah. On the other hand, of course, if you also have to pay, if the tax on broadband suppliers goes up, then everybody starts deflating the numbers which they are reading at. So this is again part of the whole idea of regulatory contest. I normally put these two graphics together to give an idea of two different ways in which the digital turn is affecting our lives as far as news is concerned. Yeah. So one, of course, is using the device of portability, the mobile phone, and the other device is the non-portable device of a TV set. Yeah. Primarily the first device, which is the mobile device of phones, the way in which digitization has unfolded is through wireless systems. Yeah. So your phone, in a sense, essentially is not connected to a wire which brings in and sends out digital signals. Yeah. As opposed to the television set, which is a non-portable device, where largely digital signals are coming through wires and not through wireless devices. Yeah. The thing to keep in mind is these graphics are not to scale, but the thing to keep in mind, the units are very different. Yeah, in a sense. Yeah. In one case, we're talking about individuals who are using devices. In the other case, we are talking about households. Yeah. Okay, so typically you multiply the graphic on the left by 5 to give an idea of how many individuals that translates into. So therefore, despite the big talk about the digital turn in mobile and so on and so forth, television still remains the most important digital platform as far as this country is concerned. And some of us think that this will last for at least another 5 years, if not more. And that's largely because the expansion in mobile connections is happening at a faster rate than the expansion of internet on mobile. So that gap between total mobiles and internet on mobile is much larger than the gap between total television and digital television. Yeah. And that, of course, also gets explained by both income inequalities across the country, but also certain kinds of geographical dispersions. Yeah. How many of you have an internet wired connection in your houses or parents' houses or whatever? A wired connection, yeah? Not through mobile. Not a wireless connection, but a wired connection, which essentially means internet comes to your house either through a telephone or it will come through your cable thing here. Yeah? Not very many hands. So again, most of you are using internet through wireless platforms. Yeah? And there are certain risks in that, and we can come to that later on. Yeah? So this, in a sense, gives an indication of the kind of demographies at a very broad level who are within the ambit of the digital turn. In other words, everybody in this country is not somebody who is engaging with this digital turn. Yeah. I'll give some certain milestones over the digital turn, the way digitization sort of unfolded as in cable news, and later on also in terms of newspapers, to give an idea of the way in which these things have moved out there. As far as cable news is concerned, digitization has kind of unfolded over close to 25 years. So from the first time cable TV came to India and news on cable TV came to India, until the time when the entire system was digitized, took close to about 25 years. Yeah. So it's a long gestation period compared to the way it happened in mobile and so on and so forth. Yeah. What is equally important in this is that there were multiple players involved in this. Many kind of interests were involved in this. So there were broadcasters, those who were producing this kind of digital news. There were cable operators who were relaying the news produced at different places. There were journalists who were using digital devices to capture and transmit certain kind of digital news programming. There were audiences, all of us, who have to make a change in the way in which we watch television, invest in television, invest in that infrastructure to try and actually access this kind of digital news which is produced. So that's kind of one part, that over this period of 25 years, the digitization of cable news involved a large number of actors at different levels of what you would call the value chain of digitization. Yeah. What we also see during this 25 years is clearly the process in which news tends to get commodified. Yeah. Okay. And by commodified, I don't only mean the fact that one is paying for news, but news as a type of information tends to get bundled with other kinds of information. So for instance, as far as cable is concerned, the way in which you subscribe to it, the way you pay your monthly tariffs, news channels are often bundled or sold together with non-news channels. Yeah. Okay, I don't know how many of you actually pay for your cable connections. You have pirate cable connections. Do your family pay for it? But if you try and look at those bills a little bit carefully, you'll actually see that news channels often get bundled with non-news channels. Essentially mean that you perhaps cannot subscribe to one particular channel in itself. Yeah. Okay? It's like when you go to a roadside newspaper vendor, you can buy in India Today separately from a Stardust, which is separate from a Times of India. Okay? So different types of information products are segregated, out of which you can perhaps choose to buy only the news product. That phenomena essentially has disappeared with the coming of digital television, where you're more or less forced to buy a bundle of products, one of which therefore is a news product as well there. The other thing which is also significant as far as the digitization of cable news is concerned, that digitization was imposed through legislation. Okay? So very much like the Aadhaar and so on and so forth, that digitalization became a part of concerted state policy. Yeah. And this was more or less introduced between 2010 and 2015. Yeah. So this is kind of a mandatory, forced move towards the digital turn. So, that digital turn in television was not something which was voluntary. So, that is kind of one point of concern. The other point of concern is that following the digital turn, following the digitization in the broadcast and cable infrastructure, we witnessed a high degree of consolidation. Consolidation means a fewer number of interests tend to own a large part of the market. Okay? So, technically the word which is used in policy documents is an accumulation of interests. So, because of the digital turn in cable news, which was mandatory, the new landscape emerged such that there was tremendous consolidation. A few number of broadcasters commanded large number of audiences. Similarly, a few number of cable operators addressed a large number of households. And this, in a sense, why I am stressing this is that this is a little bit of a paradox, because if you try and look at early debates on the digital in the 1990s, the idea was that the digital turn would actually enhance and expand democracy, both political democracy and economic democracy. As far as the story of broadcast and cable news in India is concerned, I don't know about political democracy, but clearly economic democracy is something which has got shrunk. There are fewer number of people who are owning a large number of infrastructure here. That, of course, has implications both for regulation and lack of regulation. I'll come to that later on. Yeah. So, key trends over these 25 years in the move from earlier forms to the digital turn, there has been a commercialization of news, purely at levels of money. There's been a dissolution, which means there's been a dismemberment of pre-existing systems. And therefore, for example, at one point of time, the public stroke state broadcaster, which dominated households, over a period of time has become completely dismembered and is largely based upon private broadcasters. There is also, as it happens very often with the digital turn, there's been this abundance of different kind of platforms. So, in 2001, there was one private news network, television network in the country, and the recent numbers say that they're close to 300 there. Okay? And again, this is a feature directly of the first aspect of the digital turn which I mentioned, which is the technological turn. Yeah. And that's largely because now satellites can carry more number of channels at lower prices than earlier on. There was this idea of commodification, and of course, then lastly this whole idea of digitalization as an expression of state policy. Yeah. So, if you look at these 25 years of the evolution of the slow evolution of the digital turn in cable news, we end up with these kind of insights. Yeah. What then has this sort of period brought up here? And this is something which most of you would be familiar with, at least half the stuff most of you would be familiar with. As I said, you have a large number of television channels now, this whole idea of choice which is there, whether it's a choice between similar kind of channels, similar sounding channels, or actually diverse and distinct channels, that I'll leave to your judgment. There is clearly also a scenario of the weakening of the health of news providers. So, with the increase of digitization, the spread of digitization, what we also see is not only consolidation, but we also see the financial stability of many of these broadcasters actually going down. Yeah. Okay. And therefore, I won't be surprised in the next 5 years if many of you might be not able to see TV channels which you've been seeing over the last 15 years, simply because they have been out of business. In India, again, relatively, there's been low subscription revenues. Yeah. What we pay for news compared to what we pay for other products, and compared to what people pay for news in other parts of the country, is very, very low. Okay? Typically, a news organization would try and gain revenue from two sources. One is advertising, and the other is subscription, what we pay every month or every day when we buy a newspaper. Yeah. In most of Western Europe and North America, the balance is more in favor of subscription. Okay? Whereas in India, of course, it's the other way around. Yeah. Those of you who actually buy newspapers, you might see that most newspapers still today are there available for a single digit price. Okay? And this single digit price has been there for my time, and has been there for my father's time and grandfather's time, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of one issue there. Same again in terms of television. If you actually break down your monthly subscription that you pay your local cable wala, you'll actually see that the news itself costs the least in terms of what you pay for it. And that again is a structural problem with the way in which the industry functions, because if you pay poor amounts of money, one logic is that you'll end up with poor quality of news. So there is this argument being made that, as the phrase goes, if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. That's the kind of sort of phrase which is there, So if you pay peanuts to the news guys, you'll get monkeys on your news channels. Okay? That does not mean, of course, that if you pay chocolates, you'll get better kind of news. But in terms of the argument, that's the sort of economic argument of that. The other feature, again, which is something very specific to India, which has grown over these last 25 years, is that there are two typical interests who are there in the news business which are not really there in other parts of the world. One, of course, are owners of news broadcast networks who are primarily there in other businesses. So you will have non-news interests owning news platforms. Okay, so these could be those who are interested in, whose primary interest is, let's say, petroleum, rice trade, packaging, real estate, and so on and so forth. So India, again, globally, if we look at this, we see a large amount of non-media industrial and business interests who are investing in the news, which of course has tremendous implications. The other equally important trait which is different from India is that there is a large amount of political ownership as far as news is concerned. In Europe, more or less through the 20th century, from the mid-20th century, post-war until the 80s, there was what they call a depoliticization of news ownership, which means political parties, unions, and so on and so forth, who at one point of time owned newspapers, have more or less withered away here. And newspapers are largely owned by professional for-profit or non-profit news entities. In India, of course, it's been the other way around. Again, if you make a list of those who own a large number of news outlets, both print and television, you will see tremendous amount of political ownership. And of course, this ownership gets more and more acute as you move away from Delhi. So as you go into regional news, sub-regional news, local news, you will find increasingly amount of political ownership. This will also, in a sense, concern with the kind of homework that we did. Did everybody manage to do the homework? We'll come to that later. Hands on the homework? Oh, very few hands there. Okay, but good enough to do here. So these two concerns, in a sense, are important, which have evolved over the last 25 years as well. A similar sort of milestone-based approach towards online journalism. And since many of you actually look at news online, you might remember that perhaps amongst the earliest ways in which online or digital journalism, in the narrow sense of the word, we understand, emerged in the early 2000s, when there were a bunch of independent portals who, led largely by investigative journalists, who sort of broke their news stories, what are called scoops, on websites. And then those stories got picked up from websites onto television channels, and therefore they got amplified. In the last decade, of course, then we try and see the fact that news broadcasters then also started their own websites, okay, which is, of course, one way in which you try and consume news on your phones nowadays. Following that, you also had newspapers who started their own websites. So essentially, when you're talking about digital journalism today, we're talking about three types of news producers. One, those who are in the newspaper business, who then expanded their business to online. That's one kind of thing. Not all of them did it, and amongst those who did it, not all were successful. I have a table on that. I'll come to that later on. But those who are purely in the newspaper business moved online. That's one type of interest you have in digital journalism. The other interest is that those who had broadcast news channels also moved online. Yeah. So you have broadcasters, those who are providing news to television, also subsequently moved in parallel, many of them, to provide news online. And of course, then you have the third actor, which we call native digital news producers, those who exist only in the online world. They don't have print organizations, they don't have broadcast organizations. They exist only in the online space here. Now, assuming the first two, which is the print folks and the TV folks, they are traditionally what are understood as a phrase which you would have all heard at some point of time. They constitute the fourth estate here. Everybody heard the fourth estate? Everybody? Nobody has not heard the fourth estate phrase, I hope? It's one of the biggest myths in our time, so I think you should have heard of that phrase. Okay, so the idea of the fourth estate, there are two different coinages of this. One goes to French political sciences and philosophy, and the other one deals with the American system. The idea is that in sort of late medieval, early modern times, you had these three different types of dominant power interests there. So in France, as far as was concerned, it was your nobility, it was the clergy, and it was the landed aristocracy. So three kind of interests which were there. Yeah. Of course, in the US, they look at the fourth estate primarily in terms of the estate or the power interests outside the legislature, the bureaucracy and the judiciary. Yeah. So there are two different coinages of the idea of the fourth estate here. And about 7-8 years ago, the proposition was made to try and understand the online world as the fifth estate here. So there was a distinction between the two of them. Yeah. And of course, quite clearly, as I had sort of laid out here, the business of digital journalism concerns both the fourth estate and the fifth estate here. What is interesting is that over the last 15 years, as both of them have expanded, we also see a tension between the fourth estate and the fifth estate. And this tension is not primarily in terms of business, but this tension is essentially the political tension. Yeah. Because it is argued that the fourth estate is no longer an autonomous, independent estate as opposed to the fifth estate is. And of course, the best way to try and understand this is to try and look at a series of court cases where the two parties, one represents the fourth estate, the other one represents the fifth estate here. And there's been this large number of cases where journalists from newspapers and from broadcast houses are actually trying to sue journalists who work purely in the online space here. The Dutt versus Kunte case, of course, was a landmark case in 2009, but this is something which is going on and so on and so forth. So there seems to be this contest over truth between the fourth and the fifth estate here. And of course, like any other contest, this also has a certain kind of regulatory framework here. The other thing which happened with the evolution of online news is the way in which social media started amplifying online news. So again, on the online world, you have two different types of players. You have those whose business is to produce news and distribute it, and those whose primary focus is to try and redistribute any kind of information, including news, which is available online. That's essentially the social media. An argument, of course, is being made over the last 3 years that not only is social media amplifying news, which means more people get news from a newspaper or from a broadcast station or from a native digital news website, not by going to their websites, but actually getting that news through different forms of social media, primarily Facebook and Twitter as well. Yeah? So there's this amplification role of social media which becomes significant. This also has regulatory implications. Just keep a mark on this. I'll come on to that later on. Yeah. More than social media, of course, the whole idea of platforms in a sense is emerging. And platforms essentially, well, social media are also platforms. Platforms are essentially large-scale aggregators of information. Okay, they're like a mall. They sell a large number of things online. One of those things includes news as well. There. Okay, so for example, there's an argument that besides your large music and video sites, even Google or Facebook acts like a platform there. Again, it does two things. It encloses audiences and it makes each audience visible there. Okay? And therefore, traditionally, the way in which the online world was being used was that websites of newspapers, of broadcast groups, and of native digital groups were trying to distribute news through the internet. So the internet was seen as a means to distribute news produced by folks online. Yeah. With the coming of social media and especially search as well, the emphasis now is that news no longer is distributed, but news actually has to be discovered there. So there is this shift from distribution of news to discovery of news. Okay, so typically, in a sense, the idea is that you go to a search engine and you try and look for a particular kind of news. That news, therefore, the search engine enables news to be discovered by the user, as opposed to a scenario whereby news outlets are purely distributing news directly or indirectly to the users. And this, of course, has again very significant implications here. Again, in terms of the idea of features, what does this all actually mean? Like in broadcasting, again, there is this whole idea of abundance. Large amount of investigative journalism is happening online, both by folks in news organizations and independent journalists as well. Of course, in many cases, the negative impact of that abundance is also that the threats to journalists have also increased because of this abundance here. There has also been a dissolution of previous forms of news, as the hands in this room had shown, that there are more and more people who are looking at accessing news through the fifth estate rather than through the fourth estate here. There is this whole idea, it's a new term I'm introducing, the whole idea of massification. Massification involves not just enclosure, that more and more people who are there online, but it indicates a form of aggregation of audiences and their choices here. And of course, massification then also makes visibility much easier. Again, the best example there for you would be search. So in a sense, search, Google search, for example, in this case, tends to massify audiences. It brings large amounts of audiences together. E-commerce sites, again, brings a large amount of audiences together. In bringing them together, because they act as malls, they buy different kinds of things, there is a certain sense where these platforms get a sense of the behavior of individual users. Yeah. Okay? So if you, for example, go on one of these large platforms and listen to a particular kind of music, and you go again on the same platform to buy certain kinds of clothes or certain kinds of gifts or books, even though you still buy books, there is an idea that the personality of the individual is something which is getting mined. A thumbprint of the personality is something which is getting mined. So the platform is intelligent enough to understand that certain kind of people have certain kind of behavior and certain kind of preferences. And therefore, news then gets tailored to those kind of behaviors and preferences. Yeah. By tailored, I don't mean that news is produced for their interests, but amongst the variety of news which is available, if you do a search, you are more likely to get news that you might want to see or listen to. Okay? This is again the whole idea of discovery. The best way to try and figure out this yourself is to do a search on your computer and then go to the library and do a search at the library computer. And then you go to do a same keyword search in a cyber cafe or a friend's computer and so on and so forth. There's a large possibility that the very first page you get, you will have different kinds of stories coming to you on that same news event. Yeah. Okay? And that's because the machine gets more or less tuned to the kind of patterns what you're looking for here. The last part, of course, of online journalism is that as more and more, and this follows the previous point, as more and more of us who are trying to consume news online, there is a datafication of this process. Each time we go and view news online, there is a record of who is watching what kind of news with what kind of other preferences. Okay? And of course, this happens with all other websites. I don't know how many of you have been following the debate on data localization and data privacy in India over the last 5 years. So one of the big problems there is, and I'm again digressing a little bit because it has implications on news, is the fact that in massifying data, what is happening is that that data is then being used to try and micro-address different kind of audiences. So there are two processes happening simultaneously, which seem to be contrasting. At one level, there is the massification which is happening. And the other level is that massified data, because it makes individual users visible, it's able to address different kind of users, keeping in mind their different kinds of needs. Which essentially means, if you give a crude comparison between television and online news, if you're sitting in Gandhinagar or you're sitting in Patna, you switch on the TV, on the same channel you'll get the same kind of news. You'll view the same type of news on both channels, which is not the case if you go online and use platforms like search to try and access news. It's possible that two people sitting perhaps even in the same room might get different kind of search results, keeping in mind. This, of course, has tremendous implications as far as news is concerned. This is an illustration of what I had mentioned in terms of the three different types of actors who are there in the online news. So you have newspapers who have online websites of different sorts. You have broadcasters who also have online websites of different sorts. And then, of course, you have the native digital news producers who exist only in the online space. Couple of points which are interesting here if we try and unpack this table. One is the fact that despite the digital turn, what you see is that the fourth estate actors are still very prominent on the internet. And this goes back to the point which I had made in the beginning, that perhaps the digital turn has not produced new type of actors and interests in the online space. It has, as far as this data goes, conveys the fact that pre-existing actors and interests have been able to reformulate themselves such that they sort of retain certain kind of dominance. So for example, IndiaTimes.com, which is the Times of India website, so it's a website which is also coming from a newspaper. So both in the newspaper world and in the online world, they remain on the top. Similar, of course, with the case of Hindustan Times, or in this case, Zee News as well, which is one of the leaders in the Hindi platform. And therefore, the native digital websites are still have a long, long way to catch up there. And this is again significant, that although many of us tend to access news through native digital websites, Scroll, News Minute are the more common ones, Wire as well there, they overall have a very small audiences there. And that, in a sense, there is therefore a big difference between the legitimacy they carry and the actual number of audiences they get. There is this sort of tension between the two of them. How this will unfold is something which we'll see in time. The other important insight coming from this is the fact that traffic, or those of us who actually get news from these websites, are largely directed by search. So in a sense, although, for example, Times of India is ranked number 1 as far as news sites are concerned, over 40% of those people who see news on the Times of India website are actually doing that because of the search of Google. So there is a kind of in-between mediator, which is ensuring audiences move to these particular kind of sites. And of course, the biggest regulatory challenge, and I'll talk about this later when we move to regulation, is also the fact that do search engines then become intermediaries in providing access to these kind of websites. So what happens, for example, if Google one day gets up and finds out that, okay, I should perhaps direct my traffic more towards website B than to website A. So independent of the quality and variety of news on a website, independent of the scale and size of the website, the traffic that comes to the website is largely coming through search engines. Okay, and you see, not surprisingly, except for one, in the case of Z India, you have close to 1/3 plus viewers of these sites coming through search. So in this case, in a sense, the argument is that is the intermediary benefiting more than the actual news producer financially? In terms of values, is the intermediary able to divert attention away from those who are producing news towards their own power? And this again connects with my larger interest of the idea of market power. So where does market power lie? Who is the powerful entity as far as online news is concerned? Is it those who produce news online, or is it those who are playing an intermediary role in facilitating our access to those who produce news online? That again is a question both for business and as far as regulation is concerned. So with this environment, those milestones of online journalism, what exactly is the dynamics of online journalism here? It's largely in English. If you go back to our table here, the top sites are largely English language websites. So which again conveys the kind of demography who's involved in the online space. So that's one kind of issue. The native digital websites, they are still largely dependent upon non-profit, charitable, philanthropic money. There is a sustainability issue there. Online news again is hampered by low subscription. And that goes to my next show of hands. How many of you pay for the news that you get online? Anybody pays? Yeah? Oh, 3 concerned citizens are in this room at least. Do you give a donation or do you give a subscription? Subscription, okay. The rest of you are all free riders? You just kind of go and consume, okay. So again, if you pay, if you give peanuts, you get monkeys. If you don't even get peanuts, I don't know what you'll get there. I've done a study by talking to news owners of 3 newspapers who were managing their digitization. There was Dainik Jagran, the Hindi paper, Hindustan Times English, and Malayalam Manorama in Malayalam. And what emerged from the discussions with owners and journalists was the fact that digitization in news is something which was a more top-down kind of process. Digitization happened because the owners perhaps wanted the newspapers to expand from print to online. And as I had said earlier, the digital turn in cable news was mandatory and through legislation. The digital turn in newspapers was not mandatory, not through legislation, but seemed much more top-down. And there was an argument being made that many of those who actually produce news, essentially journalists, are not that central to the digital turn in newspapers. In other words, it's the owners and the managements who are more keen to try and push the digital transition of newspapers. So with this kind of background of the way in which digitization has unfolded, the way in which the implications have unfolded, I now sort of talk about the idea of regulation. And this is the kind of last bit of this before we wind this session up here. Regulation as a field of contest essentially has 2 parts to it as far as the media is concerned. More specifically as far as news is concerned. Because news is this very strange kind of 2-faced animal. On the one hand, news stands for a particular kind of speech, and therefore debates on free speech, freedom of expression are connected with news. So there is the speech part or the speech face of news. But at the same time, news is also a business, and therefore it requires a certain kind of infrastructure. So in short, news at one level concerns meaning, the creation and circulation of meaning. At another level, it also involves the creation of the means to create meaning. Yeah. And this is again something which is peculiar to the news business. In no other kind of industry you will see these two different kind of economic products which are being involved here. Okay. And of course, the economics of speech is very different from the economics of infrastructure. Yeah. The economics of infrastructure, the way you make money through infrastructure is similar to the way in which you make money through other kind of infrastructures there. Okay. Whereas the economics of speech and the way in which you can make money through speech is very different. Yeah. So, two kinds of economic frameworks seem to be coexisting here. As far as regulation is concerned, again, this leads to a complexity, because the way in which speech gets regulated has its own kind of history, and the way in which news making infrastructure, including human infrastructure, gets regulated again has its own typical kind of history here. What do we mean by news as speech? So, we are talking about news as the creation of meaning. So, we create meaning by using words, by sounds, by visuals, by moving visuals, by advertising. So, if you look at a news entity, you will see different forms of speech which are being used there. Okay? And of course, all of them then also become objects of regulation, something I will look at more detail in the second lecture. But at the same time, news entities are also forms of infrastructure. It means they use material resources, okay, they use human resources. These infrastructures are organized in particular institutional frameworks. There are norms and rules for that, both internally and vis-a-vis other entities. And of course, these infrastructures also stand for certain kind of actors or certain kind of interests here. So, certain kinds of infrastructure stand for certain kind of interests here. And clearly, when I kind of unpack this way, it kind of gives an idea that the object of news regulation is far more complex than what is normally being talked upon in terms of free speech. And this is something which, again, most of you are familiar with. If you see a rally or a demonstration, and this is a season of demonstration nowadays, but even before this, if you actually saw a demonstration concerning news, most of the placards and banners would talk about aspects of speech getting infringed there. Okay? Because that sort of is in the legacy of debate of freedom of expression. Yeah. In very few cases, you'll actually see those banners talking about issues of infrastructure. Again, next time, if any of you see this demonstration by journalists, try and notice the posters which concern speech or infringement of speech, and the posters that concern the infringement of infrastructure. Yeah. And a very large amount of those posters actually would concern the former and not really the latter. Yeah, you know. And that, in a sense, for me is a point where I start to try and what I would call rebalance or reformulate the way in which regulation of the news has to be looked at. Yeah. Okay. This is there, of course, even in television as well. Yeah, for example. So you'll have a scenario whereby issues on free speech tend to attract much more debate in the media and even outside that than tensions arising from the clamping down of infrastructure. Yeah. Okay. At the most, you'll hear reports saying that a newspaper office, the Bijli was shut down. Yeah. That's the max you'll actually tend to hear. Yeah. Okay. But there are more important things, and I'll just list some of them out. For example, the very materials which is being used to create news again becomes an object of regulation. So, in the old days, newspapers. So, the way in which you price newsprint, not newspapers, the way you price paper on which news gets printed, that is and remains an object of regulation. Yeah. So, by controlling the price of newsprint, one can more or less control the types of interests who get involved in news making. So, if newsprint has a particularly lower price, it's possible that those who have more modest sources of income could start producing a newspaper. On the other hand, if the price of newsprint goes up tremendously, artificially or through other kinds of information, that clearly leaves out or siphons out people who don't have capabilities to use that particular kind of material there. The second example, which comes, of course, with, and again, this is something which all of you have heard of, the most important resource nowadays for digital news is something called spectrum. Okay, so spectrum is a disembodied form of newsprint. So spectrum is the most important resource used to create, but more importantly, to circulate news which is online. It could be spectrum which is used by broadcasters. It could also be spectrum which is in a sense available to your mobile phones. Everybody knows the idea of spectrum? You know what spectrum is? So essentially what happens is when you're using wireless systems, imagine spectrum being a pipe. Spectrum is a pipe through which information moves from the point where it's produced to the point where it's actually consumed. So let's assume the fact that news is produced in a TV studio. Okay, how does it reach your household? That news then gets transmuted into radio waves, to put it very simply. Those radio waves go up to a satellite. And then they come down to your cable station near your house. And from that cable station, it can come to your house either through cable wires or through other means. Okay, so think of spectrum in terms of pipes, invisible, disembodied pipes, which carry information. Okay, as opposed to embodied material like paper, which also carries the same information or similar information, comparable information to your households. So quite clearly, if a change in the price of spectrum is going to affect the ways in which certain entities are able to produce and make news affordable as a business venture to them. Okay, and that's why, for example, I mean, in the old days when there was a block or a clamp down on the news media, I mean, one of the common use mechanisms was to try and ensure that newsprint becomes scarce. Because if there is less newsprint in the market, there is more pressure on newspaper manufacturers to actually try and produce news. Here, of course, it gets much more simpler that to try and filter or block news, the best way is to get rid of spectrum. Okay, so if you're not able to transmit information through wireless systems, that clearly prevents the way in which you get access to news. So if you're unable, for example, to see news on your cell phones, it's largely because those pipes which is carrying the news from the newsmakers to you have got blocked at different points of time. So essentially a mobile internet blockage essentially is where spectrum is used, the pipe of spectrum is actually blocked here. Okay, the news does exist, but it's unable to reach you because those pipes are blocked here, or reach your phone in particular here. The other important aspect besides materials for infrastructure is the actors. So who are the people involved in producing news? And we talked a little bit about this earlier. Are they professional journalists? Are there entities who are extensions of business groups? Are they political entities? If they are political, are they national political parties? Are they regional political parties? Are there non-political interests? Okay. Are they independent journalists who are not employed by anybody producing this kind of news? So again, the possibilities offered after the digital turn has led to a scenario where a large number of actors, of course, get involved in the process of producing and circulating news. Of course, in terms, that includes all of you as well. How many of you have ever sort of written a comment to a newspaper on the website? Yeah. Okay. So, so the way, of course, in which it sort of it shapes news is that very often newspaper online news groups are watching not just who is watching, but also the kind of comments they get. And quite often they tend to sort of tune their news stories and the priorities, keeping in mind the feedback that you get, which is something which is not possible at all in television, and it was possible in a very small way as far as newspapers is concerned. Yeah. And since none of you have read newspapers, I don't think anybody has written a letter to the editor in newspaper. Anybody has written a letter? Oh, okay. So you are the analog come digital folks. Okay. So yeah, so this whole idea of the readers and listeners and viewers of news contributing directly or indirectly to the process of production of news again is something which is directly a consequence of the digital turn. Yeah. This is something which is not kind of possible. The other kind of consequence, again connects with actors, and I should perhaps not raise this question here, but how many of you, in addition to writing comments, have circulated fake news? Yeah. Not one person? Okay, let me rephrase the question. How many of you have circulated information online which subsequently you felt was incorrect? Oh. Half a hand or full hand? Okay. Subsequently you found it incorrect. Okay. So again, these are actors who are sort of perhaps consciously, unconsciously circulating information which could be seen as news, which is perhaps not news. Yeah. But of course, the way in which you are all professional scholars, there are also people who do this professionally. Yeah. Their whole task is to actually start churning out, consciously churning out the way in which news kind of comes. Yeah. And of course, I mean, those are equally organized industrial units. Many of them are not necessarily located in the same country. They are located in other countries and so on and so forth. So the actors involved and therefore the interest involved in digital online news are far wider, far bigger, far geographically spread than the actors and interests who are involved in the fourth estate news production. And again, this has both challenges and implications as far as regulation is concerned. Yeah. It's 1 o'clock. I'll just finish this last slide of what is regulation, introduce the idea, or should maybe just move to this slide actually. Yeah. And just keep everybody calm. Yeah. So 1 o'clock I was told, right? Yeah. So we'll keep this in mind if you can retain at least some of this, and we'll talk more specifically on how does regulation deal with this and what's the implication of dealing with that, with the way in which news is understood both as speech and as infrastructure. Yeah. Yeah, anybody has done the homework? There were like 4 hands or something. Okay, do you want to start with just give the name of the news organization and whatever you found? Mike, sorry. Yeah. Okay. And there were some hands this side also? Okay. You can keep this one. Right. Yeah. First, let us finish and then we come back. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So I have, for the local newspaper, so I have taken up a Bengali newspaper, Anandabajar Potrika. It is owned by the ABP Group, and the CEO is Dipankar Dash, who is from 2007. Yeah. The news channel will be, it's something called 24 Ghanta. It's again owned by a big media group, the Z Media Group. And the owner is Subhash Chandra, who is a member of Rajya Sabha.
Okay.
And the news portal would be Kolkata 24/7. So it's owned by a private company called Nexval Infotech Private Limited. And 3 of the family members are the joint owners of the company, and this news portal has been running on from 2013.
Okay, so 1 out of 3 is politically owned. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, next one.
So I was not looking at those commas as commas, but slashes. I thought that we should pick up like one body, one work, whatever. So I was looking at Khabar Lahariya, and actually I also wanted to compare two, like one which is local Hindi but has spread much wider and has been much older. So Khabar Lahariya basically in Bundeli is well established, So it was inaugurated in 2003 and 6, respectively, in 2 languages. It's an initiative to look into rural journalism, to look at exclusively reportage from UP, and especially by reporters who are women and from the marginalized sections. So whether Dalits or Muslims or Kols, which are the tribes there. So they have 22 reporters as of now, and they do grassroots coverage. The interesting thing is that they've also trained them digitally to keep up with media footage that they get on WhatsApp, etc.
Yeah, could you just keep it short? Just the news
Yeah.
organization
So
and the
basically,
owner.
the owning organization, the initiative was started by an NGO called Nirantar in Delhi, and one person who was the joint owner has now branched off into something called Chambal Digital. So she's also part of Chambal Media now. The second, Punjab Kesari, because it's so popular.
Yes.
But it's owned by the Chopra family. So, and it's very, very old, but in times of riots in Punjab, both the owner and the son were assassinated. So it's been running ever since. Not the owner, sorry, the editor-in-chief. So one family seems to have monopoly over the newspaper till now. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Anybody else on the side? Yeah, right there. Just the owner and just the name and the owner.
Yeah. Oh, so actually, I also looked up onto ABP, ABP as a institution, and it kind of, just to kind of give a better overview, it's like currently it was headed by Obik Shorkar, who was used to be the editor. Now majority of it is owned by Arup Shorkar, his brother, and it is divested. The 75% of the group's interests are between him and his family members, the immediate family, which is Otidev and Orithro Shorkar, who kind of, I think, Otidev probably has a major stake in ABP News, the global, the Hindi news portals and network in a sense. And then there is, so how the spread also happens is like Obik Shorkar's daughter, Chiki and Buka, I think these are the 2 films and names, and they also own Juggernaut Publishers, which is also an emerging, publication house in the Indian indie press as well.
Well, you can start when I take the mic there. Yeah, just the organization and the
Yeah, so the fallacy here is I will be continuing what Joyadi and Shantanuda said. So I have also by default looked into Anandabazar Potrika. Yeah, I'll just add one thing. Actually, I had dug deep into the background of it, but I'll not go into that. I'll just add to whatever they said, that the editor-in-chief, as he said, was Arup Shorkar, but the general editor is Anirban Chattopadhyay. Yeah, so that's it. Yeah.
So I looked into 2 newspapers, Bardhaman Potrika, that is owned by Bardhaman Private Limited, directors of which are Amit Roy, Achindranath Tagore and Munjima Bhattacharya. Another thing that I looked into was the Sun Marg's editor and founder. It's like a Hindi daily, but like it is related to a politician named Vivek Gupta, who is a member of parliament and is like affiliated to Trinamool Congress.
Okay, so 1 out of 2 politically owned in this case. Yeah.
I looked at multiple newspapers, however, I'll point out only 2. The Pioneer is owned by Chandan Mitra. He was an MP in Rajya Sabha from 2003 to 16, and the new Network 18, it was owned by Raghav Well, but now currently it's owned by the Reliance Industries. So it's a corporately owned.
So 1 out of 2 is politically owned and 1 out of 1 is industrially owned. Please.
I looked up Amar Ujala, that is prevalent in North India, and Rajul Maheshwari is the owner, and the entire thing is owned by Maheshwari and Khare family.
Okay. So it's also family owned. So a lot of family owned businesses here.
Yeah, hi. I looked at Gujarat Samachar. It is one of the leading Gujarati newspapers, and I think one of the newspapers with largest readership in India. Almost more than 46 lakhs as per readership survey 2014. And it is owned by Shreyan Shah. He is also the editor. And I think it was founded in 1932 and acquired by his father in 1952. And they have also a news channel. They launched in 2012.
Anybody else? Another, you got another one? Okay, but let her finish and then complete.
Okay, all right. We'll take that first and
as
then I'll
well.
come here, on that end.
Yes. Right.
Founded by Ramoji Rao in 1974.
Yes.
And he is an Indian businessman, a film producer,
Yeah.
a journalist, media entrepreneur, and an educationist.
Okay.
And then the headquarters is in Hyderabad.
Fine.
And
Okay.
it's launched on the 10th of August 1970.
Okay. Fine. Yeah. Sorry.
So the Saskatoon Star Phoenix is well over 100 years old now, but for quite a while it's been owned by a variety of major newspaper chains. It's now Post Media, which are close to bankruptcy and own probably around half the newspapers in Canada.
Okay. So that's important. This is bankruptcy has got globalized for the press. There's bankruptcy everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, so I did my homework too. There are two newspapers that we figured out. One is Odia newspaper called the Samaj, which was owned by Gopabandhu Das, and it was founded in 1919, the Samaja, and it has been a very strong, one of the longest running newspapers of the country until now. And the other one is from here, Gujarat, Mahatma Gandhi's Harijan and Young India, 1933. Is when it was started, and Navjivan Trust still goes on strong, and they have not been able to publish any more of these newspapers, but the archiving is very, very beautifully done by.
Okay.
By
This is an interesting example because it's owned by a politician, but it's run by a trust. That's a kind of combination kind of thing to keep in mind as well. Yeah. Like our area is also owned by a trust and so on and so forth. Okay. So that's the, it's good. Sometimes if everybody doesn't do the homework, the whole thing just ends up pretty fast, yeah. So just to give an idea, there are three kinds of trends emerging. One, of course, is the example which she gave of Reliance. It's a big conglomerate owning many things, including a newspaper and TV channel and digital, which subsequently has shut down. The other one is political ownership, directly politicians owning certain kind of news interests. And of course, third thing is non-industrial, non-political, but family-owned enterprises. Yeah. So they are like, completely family-run kind of companies there. This would have some significance as we go down further into this. Yeah. Okay, thanks for this. I'll continue the thing after the break. Just to recap, we kind of left it at this place. What we realized was the fact that you had two sort of faces of the news media. One is the speech that it produced, and therefore speech becomes an object of regulation. The other thing is, of course, is the means which are used to produce this speech, and therefore that means also becomes an object of regulation. Yeah. Getting into the mechanisms of regulation, there are kind of three ways in which perhaps intent is operationalized. Yeah. And these are kind of three typical regulatory tools. Excuse me. The first one, of course, is code, is the colonial statutes, which are from the mid-19th century. They are largely responsible for speech regulation scenarios which we have even till date. Yeah, okay? So hate speech, obscenity, and so on and so forth could actually be traced back to colonial statutes. Yeah. Then, of course, we have legislation, which is acts of parliament, which were introduced at different points of time. In some cases, the parliament unilaterally sees reason and introducing a regulatory mechanism. In some cases, the parliament is sort of nudged by the courts that a particular issue needs legislation, and therefore it turns into an act. Yeah. The third form of regulation is sort of what's called executive order, where essentially the government, which is the executive, issues different kinds of ordinances or orders. The orders normally have a longer span of life. Ordinances are more limited. And here again, they could be either unilaterally, or it could be in response to the courts, or interestingly, very often executive orders are introduced so as to bypass parliament. Okay, because if an executive, if a particular mechanism has to go into parliament, it needs a certain kind of majority. So we do see instances whereby the government chooses to introduce a regulatory intervention through the executive so as to bypass the parliament. And therefore, the interesting thing about the third cases is the fact that those kinds of mechanisms are not democratically endorsed here. They are not endorsed by the highest legislative body of the country. Just to give you an idea, there will be just a bunch of kind of data on this in terms of different kinds of things. So if we try and, for example, look at newspapers and we divide it into two, those mechanisms which regulate the speech of newspapers, okay? And goes back to the 1860 when the penal code was inaugurated. And therefore, things like defamation, sedition, hate speech, and libel, which is common today, they derive their legitimacy from instruments which were over 150 years ago. In legislation, it's interesting to try and see that, the Official Secrets Act, which is 1823, is a mechanism which prevents information from going outside the government. And therefore, in a sense, it works as an impediment for journalists to access certain information which can then translate into public interest news. On the other hand, the Parliamentary Privileges Act 1956 is a mechanism which empowers journalists to have access to certain kind of power centers, especially the parliament in this case. So we see by legislation two different kinds of instruments coming in, one which are impeding and the other one is relatively more empowering. The Press Council of India, I don't know how many of you have heard of it, has their sort of own norms for journalistic code of conduct, which then of course were extended to other news organizations. The RTI Act, again, is something which is a mechanism which legitimizes access to information held by public bodies, not only to journalists, but also to private citizens. And there's been an interesting amount of research happening, not just in India, but even globally, to show how journalists are actually using the RTI Act to enhance their kind of reportage which is happening. In terms of executive orders, there was a guideline which was made by the News Media Accreditation Guidelines. These are sort of, again, more functioning as norms rather than hardcore laws functioning for the behavior of journalists. When it comes to news infrastructure, the thing is that all newspapers in India, unlike in other parts of the world, have to be registered as entities. Okay, and they get a number from which they get registered. That registration does not have any fee to it, okay, but they need to be purely registered. And once they are registered, they get certain kind of support from the government, and of course, they can also be fined in different ways. Again, I don't know how many of you have been following recent debates, but this is something which is being reformulated over the last month and a half or so. And I'll talk a little bit about this towards the end because it concerns certain questions which were raised about social media policy and so on and so forth. The Companies Act, and again, these are slightly two tangential mechanisms. If you recall what I was talking about, tangential mechanisms. These are mechanisms not specifically addressing the press, but there's the Companies Act or the Competition Act. These are addressing all forms of business, but they do have implications for news outlets. And I'll give an example, for instance, that like somebody, he had mentioned here that, there's an owner and there are sub-owners and so on and so forth. The issue is very often entities which invest into the press do so in a more surreptitious kind of manner, either from within the country or from outside the country. Okay? So that's one implication about the idea of Companies Act. The other implication is in terms of what I had mentioned earlier about concentration. So the whole idea of concentration or the accumulation of interest is that one entity doesn't own or control a reasonably large amount of the press. But the problem, of course, is in the definition of one entity. If there are entities which are indirectly held by other entities, who are then further owned by other entities and so on and so forth, what we call, vertical ownership here, then it becomes a bit difficult to figure out who is the entity, who is actually the owner here. Is that point clear? Let me give an example. Let's say, for instance, there is entity A, which owns 60% of the audience in one particular sector. And an argument could be made that that entity actually has a near monopoly or at least a dominant position in the press market. But if that entity A could argue that only 30% of its ownership of audiences is by company A, because the other 30% would be by company B, without disclosing the fact that company A and B also have cross-holding, which means some part of interests are owned by both companies. So the Companies Act, again, it was redrafted 7 years ago. This loophole has remained, and this loophole is, and I'll illustrate this later on, led to a certain kind of increase in concentration in the media environment. DAVP stands for the Directorate of Audiovisual Publicity. It's an arm of the government which provides advertisements for all kind of news outlets. Okay, so if you see advertisements for government products, government schemes, and so on and so forth, that largely comes from DAVP. So essentially, this becomes a source of revenue for newspapers. Okay, and there have been cases over the last 60, 70 years, much more so over the last 15 years, whereby the provision of DAVP money to newspapers becomes a way in which the behavior of newspapers are fine-tuned, so to say. Okay, and this is, of course, a phenomenon which is much more sharper at the regional levels. And lastly, of course, at the level of infrastructure, there are also regulation of the amount of foreign direct investment coming into newspapers and news channels and so on and so forth. And these, of course, are again directed at one level across different kind of platforms. At certain levels, they are directed specifically for television news, print news, and online news. This is the other big debate which has happened over the last 6 weeks, and it might head Parliament next month, and then, of course, many more of us would hear about that. If it goes to cable news, I won't repeat the common elements which are there as well. It's more incremental. There was, again, the Cable Networks Act of 1995. That's again through legislation, which means Parliament had mandated that, which sort of gave an idea of the kind of content which could not be carried. It's called the Program Code. It also, in a sense, prohibited cable networks from themselves providing news. Because what happens, and I don't know how many of you might remember this, in the earlier years, in addition to the news channels that you get, even local cable networks had their own kind of quote-unquote news being produced and circulated in that area. That has come under certain kind of regulation. So that kind of speech produced by cable operators has been mediated and tempered more strongly than speech produced by broadcasters. Again, infrastructure, I won't repeat the common sort of elements, but because broadcasting deals with the relay of signals in wireless conditions across air using spectrum, as I clarified earlier, this comes under the Wireless Telegraphy Act, which is again 130 years old or something of that sort, which of course puts restrictions on what kind of entities can actually use the airwaves to transmit different kind of signals, including signals having news. And therefore, one needs a license for this. And that's the big difference between broadcast news outlets and newspaper outlets. Newspapers don't need a license, they need to be registered, and the registration cost is more or less zero. On the other hand, news broadcasters need to seek a license here. And there is an annual fee for that license, and that, of course, fee has changed over different points of time. So we already see that two different forms of speech on two totally different types of infrastructures are regulated in different ways here. Speech produced through newspapers requires the infrastructure to be registered, whereas speech produced through broadcasters requires the infrastructure to be licensed here. So it's a kind of an uneven sort of playing field between two different types of entities here. You would have also heard of the TRAI, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India. It's into news for good and bad reasons over the last 4 or 5 years. They are the organization which determines mechanisms for tariffs. So whatever we pay for our cable operator and so on and so forth, large parts of that actually comes from decisions by the TRAI. They also provide a regulatory framework for what's called interconnection. And this interconnection is important because I'll come back to that later on when I talk about platforms and social media. So to think of a scenario whereby you have three essential entities. Yeah. You have broadcasters who are producing news, you have cable operators who are redistributing that news, and then you have the audiences. Yeah. Okay. We as audiences pay whatever the cable operator is asking for us in a particular point of time. Yeah. But think of a cable operator is somebody who is trying to redistribute a large number of channels. Yeah. Typically in a household you get about 400 to 500 channels. Yeah. The issue there is that does broadcaster A provide TV signals to cable operator A at similar rates than broadcaster B also to the cable operator A. So think of this as a market of wholesale products. There is one distributor called the cable operator. There are multiple manufacturers, multiple brands you could call them, who are broadcasters here. The job of the cable operator is to try and interconnect the signal coming in from the broadcaster and taking it to your house. In that process of interconnection or relaying signals, it's possible that the cable distributor might provide preferential deals to certain broadcasters and non-preferential or perhaps even penal deals to other broadcasters. And therefore, this idea of providing interconnection, which actually comes from telecommunication, becomes very significant here. Is the level of relaying of information in different parts of the value chain happening in an open, transparent and fair manner? To think of the idea of the news as being something like an industrial value chain where there are multiple entities involved. At each stage, information, in this case news, is relayed from one entity to the other. Okay? And in this process, it's possible that some of those intermediaries might be behaving in an unfair or a preferential manner to some of those entities whom they are getting the news from. Yeah. This, of course, could be responsible whereby to make the certain kind of channels that you get at your home more expensive than the others. Yeah. So interconnection, in a sense, becomes an important type of regulation. Yeah. The TRAI itself was an act through an act of parliament. Same was the case of the Cable Networks Act of 1995, which, besides its speech aspects of it, also put limitations in terms of whether an owner in one part of the news business could also own another part of the news business, which essentially means if I own a newspaper which produces a certain kind of speech, can I also own a television news channel which also produces similar speech but in a different format? Yeah. Because if I own in a local area both the leading newspaper and the leading broadcaster, then one can safely assume that I have a dominant position in that local market of news as speech. Is this argument clear? So typically what will happen is there will be a large bunch of newspapers who are competing, let's say, for the market in Gandhinagar. It's also possible that there are a large number of broadcasters who are also competing. Both of them are competing amongst themselves. So one form of speech is competing with other rival forms of speech. And they are, of course, two totally different kinds of markets here. The newspaper market and the television news market. What if is in a scenario whereby in one case newspaper A dominates the newspaper market and broadcaster A dominates the television market? The argument is as long as there is one player dominating each market, to some extent that argument is tenable. However, if it's the same owner who also has a newspaper and a television news broadcaster in the same market, we will lead to a scenario whereby one owner is dominating two different forms of speech. That kind of domination is known as the accumulation of interests. You are accumulating interests, infrastructural interests across two different markets, and because of that, you are also accumulating your power of speech. Essentially, therefore, you are enhancing your media power. Is that argument clear? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, sorry. Sorry? Yeah, so I'm coming to that. The argument against accumulation of interest, and there are sort of multiple arguments for that, is the fact that if the assumption is that news is a public good, then what follows from that is that there ought to be a diverse set of voices who are providing reportage and perspective. Yeah. And therefore, arguments against accumulation of interests leverage the value of diversity. I talked about value right in the beginning here. Okay? So, it may not be an economic problem. In fact, there are arguments to say that accumulation increases economic efficiency here. But the argument there is that it's not desirable to have one owner dominating the market of speech in different markets of news here. Okay? If they dominate it completely, then it will lead to a monopoly. If they dominate it even more than 50%, then we call it different forms of what's called market dominance here. Okay? Yeah. So the Cable Television Networks Act did have certain statutes on that. Yeah. Okay? And the statutes were very loose. I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. They were capped at 20%, yeah, which means the cross ownership. If I own a newspaper, I can't own more than 20% of a news broadcaster. And if there's a news broadcaster who can't own more than 20% of a cable network, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So the idea is that both across the value chain, horizontally, which means broadcasting and cable, and even vertically in a sense, for instance, between different kinds of speech producing organizations, there should not be one entity which is dominating speech in that particular market. Yeah. That's essentially the idea it is. So to answer your question, there were caps on the limits of accumulation of interests in the Cable TV Networks Act. But monopoly per se was not being defined here. And that's a larger kind of debate on Indian competition law, to what extent it recognizes monopoly. And that debate is still open actually, yeah. But there's nothing as such in television, which more or less, or even newspapers, which defines the idea of monopoly. But the way in which things are going, I do see in the next 3 or 4 years some sort of regulation coming in on defining monopoly here. Okay? Online news. Again, thing to keep in mind, of course, in online news, again, I'm talking about incremental regulation. Besides those forms of regulation of speech which existed for newspapers and for news broadcasters, digital journalism also comes through, as we saw in the classroom earlier in the afternoon, through wireless forms. Most of you see newspapers and so on and so forth on your phones here. Okay? And therefore, the Information Technology Act comes into play. This actually regulates the kind of content which is flowing through wireless networks here. Okay? It's coming from telephones and so on and so forth here. Very often you would hear about newspaper reports or even government orders, some of them came over the last few days as well, about blocking certain kind of news outlets or taking down some kind of news which is already gone online. Yeah. Okay? Those kind of actions actually derive their legitimacy, their power from the Information Technology Act. It also puts certain obligations on where information is stored. If you recall, when I talked about digitization, the digital turn deals not only with the transmission of information, but also where information is stored there. Okay? And this, of course, brings servers as objects of regulation. So it's not just the kind of information which is flowing onto your phone, but information which perhaps would be stored. Currently is being stored on clouds, and therefore there's been discussion on that. But servers again become an object of regulation. In the US, for example, for many years, different states had laws for servers, and therefore you could find that servers being moved to particular parts of the US, because they were a little bit more liberal. Same thing happened in Europe, where a lot of servers were actually based in Nordic countries, in Scandinavia, because again they had relatively more liberal laws on hosting of data. So again, these are forms of speech which has gone out and then it's been taken down, or speech which has been blocked, or speech which is being stored on a particular device. All those, in a sense, come under the idea of the regulation of online speech. In terms of infrastructure, again, the IT Act has implications for the infrastructure which goes into the creation or the management of online news. Data protection is something which some of you would be familiar with. There's a bill which is being debated and so on and so forth. And I think this becomes a little bit important as well for journalists who are moving information from their phones to the office and so on and so forth. Is that information visible? Should it be encrypted and so on and so forth? So those issues again become part of as an object of regulation. And of course, largely what were called the intermediary guidelines, which are essentially guidelines given for those actors in the digital world who are not necessarily producers of information, but they are moving information from one place to the other, or they are helping you to try and find information. So typically, for example, a search engine. A search engine is not necessarily an original producer of information, but it's helping you to access information which is perhaps produced by somebody else. Okay? So you have, there are also guidelines for the way in which intermediaries tend to function. So this is a more kind of just some details which you need to keep in mind if you're trying to look at regulation in terms of the mechanisms involved there. Perhaps the same information then can be diced in a different way. The previous table was showing what kind of mechanisms there were. The next bunch of tables will try and actually show who is responsible for these mechanisms. Where does the power lie actually here? Okay, so essentially we are talking about 4 different types of ministries here. We're talking about the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, MIB, on the screen here. We are talking about the Ministry of Information and Communication Technology, and we're of course talking about the Ministry of IT and so on and so forth. Okay, these are sort of 3 ministries which directly deal with communication and media. And the 4th one, of course, is the Ministry of Commerce. Because it designs FDI norms for various industries, it by default also defines FDI norms, foreign investment norms, for the media industry as well. Okay. What is important here, in addition, of course, to who is controlling the power, but also whether these different institutions have the ability to enforce compliance. Compliance is to ensure that whatever objective of regulation is there is met with. And what we see from the table is all ministries do not have parallel compliance organizations. Okay, so it's possible to make an argument that despite regulation existing, it's difficult to enforce compliance because, as you see, column number 2 is empty. 2 out of 4 are empty actually. The third part, of course, is that if there is regulation and it's enforced, and that enforcement is challenged either by one company or by individuals, is there a body that can adjudicate that? Or does everybody have to go to the courts? Increasingly, what is happening in the design of regulation globally is that organizations which are introducing a regulatory framework also tend to have in a parallel an organization which has the power to adjudicate. If there is a tension or a contest over regulation which has been already introduced, which is the appropriate body to adjudicate over conflict here? The conflict could be between anybody involved in the value chain, right from the producer of information to the end consumer of information. So over a period of time, you will see more and more compliance and adjudication bodies emerging. This table itself shows that all 3 of them are in this century as well, whereas the ministries, of course, are relatively older. We then have, besides the ministries and the so-called regulators here. Okay? These are bodies which are outside the ministry. They derive their power from the various acts in a sense. Some of them, of course, are constitutional bodies like the Election Commission. They have their own power and limits to their power. Yeah. So they have a mandate which gives them certain power, but the mandate also puts limits to their power. Yeah. So for example, typically the Press Council of India does have the mandate to censure newspapers who are going a little bit wayward there, as far as their speech is concerned. Yeah. But the extent to which the Press Council is able to actually enforce compliance is questionable, because it does not have a compliance enforcement body. So it can make those norms as a regulator, but it doesn't have the teeth to enforce them. The case of the TRAI is a little bit different. It mandates, provides them only to make recommendations to the government. So those recommendations, however good or bad they are, the government might choose not to follow them. Yeah. And that's completely within the realm of the law. Yeah. So, and this is a very unique situation in India where the regulator does not have the power to enforce their own mandate. Yeah. Or the other way around. Their mandate is limited and it has the power to frame guidelines and regulations, but the compliance with them depends by other organizations. Yeah. So it's a bit of like a kind of a toothless tiger kind of scenario. Yeah. In the Election Commission, I don't know how many of you have been looking at newspapers and reports during elections in different parts of the world, different parts of the country, I beg your pardon. You'll see very often the Election Commission making orders on the type of news which is coming out during elections. Yeah. Normally before election, the run up to the elections. Yeah. And they've been focusing on two aspects of speech here. One, of course, is news, which is financed in a motivated way, the short form for that being paid news. And the other one, of course, which was much more strong this time, is about political advertising. Yeah. The way in which political parties are using, misusing, abusing their ability to advertise through different kind of news platforms. This is something during the period of elections is under the mandate of the Election Commission, which also means, of course, that outside election seasons, both these two issues are not addressed by any regulatory body here. Because the ECI has power over news outlets only in the run-up towards the elections, which means in non-election time, any other points of time, these two frictions go unchallenged there. I'll skip Skibby a little bit and focus on the Competition Commission. Again, came through an act of Parliament. And those of you are familiar with the idea of competition, the idea there is the fact that all markets, including news markets, tend to function smoothly if there is a fair amount of competition. Yeah. And of course, that level of competition is also transparent to a large extent. Yeah. It's therefore also argued that there are scenarios whereby companies, including news companies, are exerting their market power, either because interests have been accumulated or through other extra market mechanisms. Yeah. Okay. So, for example, in the old days, it was quite common to try and see that a particular newspaper, in order to distribute itself more evenly, would perhaps give an extra commission to a sales agent to distribute that newspaper preferentially than another newspaper. The same thing, of course, happens in cable distribution. Yeah. In some cases, broadcasters might provide an extra incentive, financial or otherwise, to a cable distributor so that those particular news channels are seen visibly, more clearly and easily in a particular area. So these are, in a sense, the Competition Commission therefore is interested in those issues which distort or abuse or sort of subordinate the laws of competition, assuming those laws are fair enough. Yeah. The last set of bodies who are involved are what are called self-regulatory bodies. Yeah. Now, these self-regulatory bodies, it's important to know, are not government bodies. I was talking to this about with you during the break. Yeah. Okay. So these are not government bodies. They don't have legal legitimacy. They don't have legitimacy from the Parliament, of course. They don't even have legitimacy or endorsement by the executive or different parts of the government. They are essentially more like associations of actors who are involved in that particular business here. Okay, so the Editors Guild is a bunch of editors who created, a particular entity, and they, in their given their mandate, they are supposed to try and address the way in which newspapers function. Same with the case of the News Broadcasters Association. And this is the example which I was talking to him about. The News Broadcasters Association is essentially an association of channels who are transmitting news here, as the name itself suggests here. Okay, and they themselves had set up some sort of a compliance organization, which is a News Broadcast Standards Authority here. So the argument given here is that there is no business for the government to regulate the speech which is coming out of television news channels. As an argument, that's fine. In lieu of that, the actors themselves, the stakeholders themselves, create their own norms. And they themselves bestow themselves the power to try and enforce these norms on other organizations. So this is sort of classic self-regulation. You could call it peer-to-peer regulation in different kind of languages. The problem, of course, with this is, and this is the discussion I was having with it, is that again, although the NBSA has a compliance organization, it's not in a position to enforce compliance here. And why is that so? Because the News Broadcasters Association, like any other association, is driven by its members here. And therefore, the compliance can be exerted only as long as you are a member of that association here. Typically, what has happened in the past is that if a complaint has gone to the NBSA and it finds a news broadcaster guilty of infringing some of the norms, then the association tends to penalize that broadcaster. However, if the broadcaster ceases to be a member of the association, there is no way in which the association has adjudication over the broadcaster. Yeah. So think of this, an example I was telling you, think of this as a club. And a club, you all follow rules. One day, for instance, if you forget and you infringe a particular kind of rule, you are fined by the club. But if at that point of time you resign your membership from the club, you don't have to pay the fine. Yeah. Okay, so this is the way, that's the kind of weakness of this particular kind of model here. And this is largely a weakness of all self-regulatory models as well, that it doesn't have a way in which to try and enforce compliance here, or rather there are loopholes in which members could be tried, and of course this varies from place to organization to association, I beg your pardon. So the advertiser guys have their own kind of council, which was set up in the 80s. The cable operators have their other kind of federations. These essentially emerged as trade bodies or associations to try and fortify and enhance their interests. Over a period of time, they have also taken on the role of self-regulatory organizations. Yeah. And this is quite, and this is where in a sense the contradiction is the fact that these associations initially were formed to try and promote their interests vis-a-vis other interests in the entire business of news. Yeah. In addition to fortifying and promoting their business, they have also, or at least many of them, have also taken on the task of self-regulating that business. Yeah. And in all this case, in all cases where this has been tried, it's led to a scenario whereby enforceability is something which is not guaranteed. Yeah. And that, in a sense, largely explains the failure of self-regulation in India. So, to put this entire picture in a more graphic form, if this is what we're looking at in terms of the digital architecture, both wired, phones, TV. So you had, on the one hand, you have different sort of ministries of the government who are involved in this. So different ministries are involved in different aspects of regulation, of speech and of infrastructure. Yeah. So these are the ministries here. In addition to the ministries, you then have in pink the regulatory bodies. Yeah. Again, different regulatory bodies have different mandates for different aspects of speech and infrastructure of news. In addition to the regulatory bodies, you then, of course, have also the arbitrary bodies, which are adjudicating arms of the regulatory body. And of course, finally, then you have the so-called self-regulating organizations. So essentially what we have is a scenario whereby the entire regulatory architecture is what we call fragmented. Different aspects of news as speech and different aspects of news as infrastructure then are objects of regulation for different entities. So you don't have any one entity which is responsible for regulating both all aspects of news as speech and all aspects of news as infrastructure here. Okay, and this is a kind of classical textbook model. Anywhere globally, if you want to look at a textbook model of what's called fragmented regulatory architecture, India is the best case for that, most unfortunately so here. And therefore, of course, responsibility is very difficult to pin down here. Being organizations, you also therefore see inter-organizational tensions here. There are tensions between different ministries, there are tensions between different regulators, there are tensions between the regulators and the ministries, and of course, all other entities involved here. The more fragmented the institutional architecture is, the more probability is there of tension between these different components here. And therefore, it's less likely that there will be a consensus amongst all those involved in promoting a certain kind of regulatory framework here. Is that argument clear? How a fragmented institutional framework becomes an impediment to try and define the object of regulation and of course enforce compliance on that. This is a different way to try and understand that entire regulatory field here. Till now, we have understood them largely in terms of their own mandate as to who is responsible for what and who is not responsible for what, and how this responsibility is being fragmented between different organizations and also fragmented in terms of speech and infrastructure here. I go back to the point of power, which I made right in the beginning, about policy in a sense talking about the distribution of power. This is a simple exercise of mapping which I do with various groups when I try and look at regulation, is that to try and figure out each of those organizations which were there in the previous graphic could be ranked in terms of the power they have given the constitutional framework, given the regulatory framework and so on and so forth. Okay? At the same time, we could also rank those organizations based upon the interest they have in a particular field of regulation. So, all organizations on the previous pages, they have different extent of power stemming from their mandate. They also have different interest in the field of regulation. Is this difference clear? The idea between power and interest here. Okay? There are different ministries in the government. They have different levels of power. They are mandated with different kind of power here. Okay? So you could perhaps rank them on a particular matter. You can rank them who is more powerful than the other. Similarly, these different organizations, you can also rank them in terms of who is more interested in a particular kind of area. Or put it the other way around, a particular kind of area such as digital journalism, how central it is to the functioning of that organization. Okay, so it's a kind of a double sort of ranking here. And if we plot this ranking then in terms of quadrants like this here, so we are going for maximum power on the right hand side to minimum power on the left hand side. Okay? And similarly, we are going from maximum interest on the top to minimum interest to the bottom. Is that part clear? And therefore, just to get the logic right, if you are on the top right hand corner, you are an entity which has maximum power and maximum interest on a particular regulatory contest. And if you are on the bottom left, then you will have minimum power and minimum interest in a particular kind of regulatory contest. Is that mapping clear? Okay. So typically what we can do is, and this is what happens in regulation, when you're comparing different countries, we try and map the various actors based upon how powerful they are to move regulation and how central that object of regulation is to their own functioning there. To give you an example, I go back to the previous page. I've written, for example, Department of Space. Now, Department of Space does have certain sort of stipulation when it comes to the way in which frequencies are being distributed across the country. Yeah. We talked about spectrum earlier on today, okay? But again, and that distribution of frequencies and spectrum is important to the functioning of news organizations, as we saw earlier, both for television and for online. Yeah. However, digital journalism or online journalism is not central to the functioning of the Department of Space. It has more other concerns to deal with here. And therefore, a Department of Space would be an organization which would be very much ranking low as far as their interest in the regulation of digital news is concerned, although it might be relatively high as far as their power is concerned. So if we go back then to this, we try and see, for example, the closest to the top right-hand corner is the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, because A, it has maximum power in terms of its mandate compared to other ministries in the government, and B, it also has maximum interest in the functioning of digital and online journalism. And therefore, we can then try and rank these organizations differently. To this we'll add, this should have been a purple, but the colors have gone a little bit wonky. To this, these are the ministries. To this we add then the regulators here. So again, different regulators have different abilities and power. So for example, the Election Commission of India has a large amount of power when it comes to elections. Within the election period is perhaps the most powerful regulator of news. But outside the election period, it doesn't really have any interest or authority to regulate the news, and therefore it will come somewhere in between. Yeah. And then, of course, to that we can then further add some of the private organizations here. So typically what we see is that the tussle becomes stronger as we move to the top right-hand quadrant here. And if you draw a map like this for different countries, you will get different kind of configurations here. For example, it's possible that in some countries, private self-regulatory organizations, which are in green here, which are right now not in the top right quadrant, actually exist in the top right quadrant here. Okay? It's also possible in a sense where in certain countries where the regulator runs supreme, the regulator actually is at the most corner point of the top right-hand quadrant here. The idea here in a sense is to, A, of course, to try and visualize these different kinds of fields of contest. This mapping, perhaps more important for some of us who are involved in this thing, also gives an idea as far as when you're planning advocacy. When you're planning advocacy or you're arguing for a change in regulation, the important thing is to try and figure out who is the body to try and address here. So, to give a very crude example, if all of you are interested in the fact that news is biased, then the question is that, and you all make very nice posters to say that news is biased, in front of which organization would you try and go to? Because very often campaigns are unable to figure out and they're sort of barking up the wrong tree. So to try and figure that out, one needs to know very clearly where does the power and the interest lie on a particular regulatory context. And as that regulatory context changes, of course, this map will also change over a period of time. Because quite clearly, all these organizations don't have the maximum power and maximum interest at all points of time for all issues there. I'll try and now look at this from the reverse side in terms of, on the left-hand side, there are features of the business. And the right-hand side, I'm trying to show actually why those features exist. So, for example, if we say that there is a large number of TV news channels, then the question, of course, would be, why are they large? They are large because there were no barriers from regulation for entry of players into the business of television news. And therefore, nearly everybody could set up a news broadcast channel there. We take any example here. Low subscription revenues. Again, we go back to subscription from the earlier session here. One of the explanations as to why there are low subscription revenues is because there is no cap on the advertising time here. I don't know how many of you see TV regularly, and amongst those you see it, how many of you actually get irritated by the ads that keep coming on television. In civilized parts of the world, of course, there are caps on the number of ads that can come in a day, and the frequency at which ads can actually come in there. Okay? We do have a regulation on that, but it's extremely loose. The point being made is that there are no effective caps, which means news organizations can try and give more and more pages to ads or more and more time to ads on their TV channels. Yeah. And the more time you actually give to advertisements, the less compelled you feel to raise revenues to subscription. Yeah. And given the two of you had raised hands on that. Yeah. If on the other hand, and this is an argument, that if there was a cap on advertisements, that you cannot have more than X number of pages of advertisements, X number of minutes of advertisements, then news organizations would more or less be forced to try and look for other ways in which they can raise revenues. Yeah. And therefore, they might pay more attention to raising money through subscription. Yeah. So this is the way in which things kind of work backwards. Yeah. There is a high degree of what we call financialization. Yeah. So typically, investments in news organizations would either come from other companies, whether they are from news or they are from other businesses. But what we find in India and many other countries as well, that a certain number of investors are also what are called financial investors, yeah, which means they don't run businesses, they don't make products, they deal with the business of money. So these are trading organizations, private equity funds, and so on and so forth. Yeah. This is typically what's called hot money. Okay, it's pure financial investment. Yeah, and typically, if pure financial investment, it comes very quickly into a market. It also equally quickly disappears from the market. Yeah. So if you have money which is kind of free floating, it can help, for example, an organization to raise money when they go for an IPO or get listed in a stock market, but that money can disappear equally fast as well. Yeah. And the argument has been made, and there is a certain amount of data on this also, that compared to other parts of Western Europe and North America, there is a high amount of hot money which is coming into the news business here. And that, in a sense, makes the health of the news organizations extremely fragile. Yeah. When it comes to licensing norms, for example, and going back to the example of political ownership and non-media ownership, in most countries, you have, when you give a license to a news broadcaster, it's also sort of spelt out what kind of entities cannot deserve a license. Yeah. So, for instance, in India, political entities are not barred from investing into a news organization, which is why you have a large number of politically owned. On the other hand, if you are an NGO or you are a trade union, explicitly you are barred from getting a license into a news broadcaster. Yeah. So this perhaps also answers your question in terms of diversity earlier. What happens to try and have a wider number of players kind of coming in here? So we try and look at this in terms of non-discriminate licensing norms. Yeah. And same thing goes to the idea of accumulation of interest here. Although there are limits to which one news entity can own another news entity, there are limits to which a broadcaster can own a newspaper and the other way around as well. Those limits are, in their regulatory power, extremely fuzzy here. There are perhaps more loopholes in that regulation than actual power in that, yeah. Which is why you therefore have this large maze of ownership across different kind of countries, yeah, different kind of companies. Sorry. Yes. Yeah. 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 I said they are not barred from investing in a news. Yeah. Yeah. Unions. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Why did that happen?
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess that has happened in 2000. And I mean, the question, of course, is quite clearly, at that time, policy was based upon certain values, and I said in the beginning, is based upon certain interests here. Okay? So the argument was made that interests that are represented by NGOs and interests that are represented by the non-profits and unions are not considered fit to be those, in a sense, who are being given a license here. And therefore, or to put it the other way around, political parties or business groups were interests which were deemed to be fit to receive a news license here. And this has not been challenged in court, so any of you can actually go to court
So
and challenge.
was that recently brought about, or
2000.
it's been 2000?
Yeah.
The year 2000.
Yeah, 2000, 2001, when the guidelines actually came up. Yeah.
So this was in Parliament or by some
So
regulator?
this was what I said, this was from executive order. So this didn't go into the Parliament. So this in a case for me is a classic example whereby if this particular mechanism or norm had gone into the Parliament, it would have been defeated there. And the government preferred therefore not to take it to the Parliament and pass it through the executive route.
So that was the then 98 government.
2000.
Okay.
Yeah. So quite clearly, in that, the regulatory framework for licensing is therefore biased towards certain kinds of interests here. That's the kind of inference we would draw from this here. Okay. Or one could say that it was biased against certain kind of interests participating in news. So, for example, it's possible that Khabar Lahariya, which is a non-profit NGO, perhaps it's a trust. I'm not sure it's a trust or a society. They could not apply for a TV news license here because they wouldn't qualify here. But on the other hand, because in online news you don't have this kind of licensing system, they could therefore have this kind of entity functioning there as well. Yeah. 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 So in community radio, the thing is that, and that goes to the other extreme here. It's saying that only non-profits would be eligible for a license here. But the thing with community radio is that their footprint is very small there. Okay, so as long as you have a smaller footprint, perhaps the bigger radio stations are not really threatened by that. Yeah. The moment you have a larger footprint, it's possible that the bigger corporate and other commercial radio stations get threatened by that. Yeah. So there are two different ways in which you could try and limit public interest here. Either you provide, in a sense, licensing framework is completely biased against that, like in the case of broadcasting, or in the case of community radio, it does exist, but it exists because the footprint or the area of operation is severely narrowed here. Okay, and therefore it doesn't, in a sense, become a threat to the more established and dominant interests here. Yeah, please.
Sir, is there a norm which says the media company should be publishing who is pumping capital into them? Are there any norms on
publishing?
That? Like who's pumping capital into them? Like who's putting money on them?
Yeah. So again, as I said, there are no norms in terms of what kind of money comes into it. Yeah.
Like there is no.
It could be hawala money. It could be money from Singapore. It could be money from wherever else. Yeah. So the types of capital are not regulated.
Okay.
Only the capital, whether it's foreign or domestic, that gets regulated there.
Okay.
But what type of foreign capital or what kind of domestic capital, that does not get regulated there. So the source of capital is capped, but not the nature of capital there.
So there is no public record of anything?
There is no?
Public record of anything?
Well, I mean, that was the example I perhaps hope that some of you might do in the homework.
Okay.
Try and perhaps locate where the money is coming from. Yes, again, like many things, there are records which are handed in. Each of these companies are supposed to give in their records to the Company Affairs Ministry every year. These are available from their website. You pay $50 and you get a report of one company. But there are, of course, problems in there. Many companies do not declare the numbers.
Okay.
Many companies declare the numbers, but not in the format in which they are asked. And in many cases, the format themselves are too vague that you can't try and figure out. Yeah. Okay. But yeah, this is a problem, and this is essentially a disclosure problem. Yeah. How streamlined the disclosure is. So, for example, if you ask me the question and I'm the government, I would say yes, the companies do declare their numbers. Yeah. Okay. But the way in which they are declared, the level of detail, the level of compliance is something which is extremely uneven in a sense. Yeah. Yeah. Is there a mic? You have the mic. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I think we don't have any regulatory norms for public service broadcasters in India, or do we have? Because in a way, I think there is no regulation on what kind of content and how much content from the government side they can broadcast, because they become a kind of handle or vehicle for government propaganda by all the governments over the years.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true. I mean, the public broadcaster more or less in India has become a state broadcaster, and this happened. Yeah, so it's interesting in a sense to try and, if you compare public broadcasters across countries, and there has been a lot of research on that, to try and show that how does the public broadcaster maintain its autonomy here, both from the government and also from the advertisers here. Okay? There are two ways in which it's generally maintained, and I'm diverting a little bit there. Is the fact that if a public broadcaster is financed by the government, yet the way in which the finances are allocated within the organization, that is left autonomous to the broadcaster. Yeah. This doesn't happen in India, it happens in many other countries. The other argument is being used is that a public broadcaster should not receive any money from the government, but try and raise its money purely from other sources. Yeah. This is a model which has been followed in some broadcasters in Germany, yeah, where they get 50% of money from the government, which means the government doesn't influence majority power in the organization, and 50% of the money they raise through ads, syndication, and other forms. Yeah, okay? So that's one model in which, and ZDF has been very successful in this model. Yeah. So you get a minimum amount of money from the government, but not enough money such that the government actually starts intervening in you. It's like in a company. If there is 50% ownership or co-ownership, obviously that person is not able to exert influence. Yeah. And the other 50% you then try and raise from other commercial sources. Yeah. So at one level you're forced to compete in the market, and on the other hand you're also given a minimum cushion by the government. And that model, to a large extent, of course, is globally recognized to be good. Yeah. There are other models, for example, in Scandinavia, Canada, I'm not completely sure about that, is that they are completely state financed, but it's called a kind of, they maintain an arm's distance. So therefore the government is not functioning in the internal organization. So because they are completely separate it's like government seed money being given to an independent company. Yeah. Okay? And then these broadcasters then report directly to the parliament. In our case, the broadcaster reports to the ministry. Yeah. So this is one level lower than, so an argument is being made, of course, that why doesn't the public broadcaster report directly to the parliament? Yeah. And therefore you can't even remove the head of the public broadcaster unless it comes from the parliament. I think the election commission is a little bit like that. You can't remove the election commission chief without, I think, some sort of endorsement from the parliament. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's like the privatization of Air India. I mean, I don't know whether that will solve the financial problem of Prasar Bharati, and I don't know whether that will also make the Prasar Bharati more objective. Yeah. So for me, it's a solution which is not addressing the problem. I mean, the solution has been arrived at before defining the problem. Yeah. That obviously is always a little bit vague.
Sir, one.
Yeah.
So, with weakening financial health,
yeah,
usually companies die off.
Yeah.
But I see that more and more cable channels are being brought about, and why is that? Like, is it because India has so much viewership that?
So there are two arguments for that again. I mean, they're not necessarily rival arguments. One argument says that if there is over competition in the market, all the companies tend to suffer. Yeah. Okay, so that's a standard sort of neoclassical economics, that a market has a certain capacity of players. Yeah. Right. If there are too many players in the market, you're actually eating into each other's revenues. Yeah. So one argument is being made here that the news broadcast space is full of over competition. So we have 300 news channels right now. Okay, and therefore the growth of TV channels is not proportional to the growth of advertising money, because advertising is actually driving television. Yeah. Okay, so one argument therefore is that over competition is a problem, and therefore there has been some regulatory discussion that to try and perhaps limit that competition. when you say you're going to limit the competition, quite clearly you're going to limit the number of players in that market.
Yeah, but in a democratic market, you usually don't.
So that goes. So that's the argument, which is the counter argument.
Yeah, you automatically like companies die off. You don't regulate the number of people.
Yeah. But the companies, again, what is interesting is that what kind of companies die out? If there are companies which are sort of bankrolled and co-owned by large corporates, they'll take a longer time to die out, even if they're producing low quality news or don't have audiences. Okay. If they are companies which are owned by political entities, then as we talked in the previous session, they are not really necessarily in the market to make profits. Okay. So they will still continue, despite having a weak balance sheet. So this whole idea of companies kind of dying out, it works in other businesses, but the argument there is that news as a public good, that market for that public good perhaps is not, those logics are not applicable for news. So if you're making Coca-Cola, and there are 10 companies making Coca-Cola, and then there are 20, and there are 30, and some of them die out, that's not a problem. But the same logic perhaps cannot be applied to the news business, because news serves a different purpose than Coca-Cola or biscuits or soap or whatever it is. Okay? So that economic logic need not necessarily be extended to the realm of news, although news also remains an economic good. And the argument there precisely is because the news functions in both these markets. It's a speech market and it's an infrastructure market. And that speech is in public interest, as opposed to cinema or music, which is not necessarily a public interest form of speech, is what I would argue here. Yeah, there's a hand there. Well, the Jio case actually went to the Competition Commission, and it ruled that the Commission ruled, beg your pardon, the Commission ruled that what Jio was doing was not anti-competitive, and there was a lot of debate following that as well.
Yeah, same happened with Ola versus the taxi drivers case, where the court said that it's for public good, they are giving discounts, so it's not a problem.
Yeah, I think the Ola thing was a little bit different in the sense that, first of all, Ola is functioning in a duopoly. It's Ola and Uber. So the market structure is very different. So that's a duopoly. The telecom example which he gave there are 4 players. Whereas in broadcasting, they are like, it's a long-tailed industry. There are multiple players operating here. So the reasons why behaviors are anti-competitive, as adjudicated by the competition regulator, will also change from sector to sector, depending upon how many players there are. So the same logic in the Ola case may not function in a market which is not a duopoly. Okay, so that's, for this particular argument.
Yeah, but I think Jio's money is being funded from their, like you said, petrochemicals business or whatever.
Yeah, but the competition regulator would not again consider a source of money.
Okay.
They will deal with whether their practices in the telecom market, as you were saying, whether those practices are anti-competitive. So, for example, if I start and giving a zero monthly tariff for 6 months, is that considered to be a practice which is anti-competitive? If I give it for 12 months, if I give it for 18 months, how long can I give zero tariff offerings?
So there was a case a couple of years back, the 2G spectrum case, that was initially a case that was given to the TDSAT, but then it moved to a CBI court. I don't exactly remember the...
Sorry, which case was this?
The 2G spectrum case.
2G spectrum, yeah.
Yeah, so
there was a lot of political involvement and the fact that the spectrums were auctioned off at a very cheap price and like there was a lot of fixing. So what do you think is the whole dynamics of the thing?
So what is interesting actually in the 2G thing, I think the argument, if I'm not correct, if I remember correctly, was the fact that there was actually no auction. The idea was that
all the people accused of the case belonged to a single political party, but they were acquitted of all the charges against them, except although the fact that there was enough evidence to acquit them of the fact that there was a lot of fixing with respect to giving out of the spectrums.
So there are two parts to it. One is the criminal part of it, okay, the latter part of what you said. I won't comment on that because I'm not a criminal lawyer. The first part I think is important in terms of how do they actually acquire the license. Okay, and this in a sense goes back to the sort of the question she was asking, that again the licensing norms for telecom, a bit like broadcasting, although they are more firm in telecom than in broadcasting, they are not perhaps, you know, granular enough to try and separate these different kinds of interests here. So if I as an investor have invested 10 rupees in telecom company A, and I've also as an investor invested in a rival telecom company B, perhaps that is not an issue which comes under the regulator's ambit here, because they're not looking at the type of money which is coming in here. And I think the 2G case was perhaps more a case of, which I had put in the beginning, the decision-making process itself was being flawed there. So the argument was that there was a subversion of the ways in which licenses were allocated. And the licenses were allocated on a kind of a preferential basis, as opposed to the way it's written in the norms. Yeah. But the problem, of course, that the norms themselves for telecom at that point of time were too fuzzy. Yeah. Sometimes the norms are too fuzzy, the guidelines are too fuzzy, it gives more space for discretion. Yeah. And as there's more space for discretion, obviously there's more space for malpractices. Yeah. So that kind of, it's a kind of a washing machine sort of effect. You know, one thing sort of feeds with the other. Yeah.
So another question, there's a cyber appellate tribunal that is there.
Yeah.
What does it take under its sphere of power? Like which all, like there is TD-SAT for TRI, but like in that graph there were a lot of sub-departments. So
yeah, so the third row in this, on the right hand side column, so that's a kind of an appellate body if the a regulation is passed and there is a conflict between different kinds of actors involved who are implicated by that conflict. This then becomes the appellate body.
Instead of going to the courts, in which respect? Like conflicts in which respect?
Dealing with the mandate of the regulations which are promulgated by the Ministry of MEITI. Okay, not dealing with other ministries. So the MEITI has a mandate. Okay, so anything which is any regulation which is stemming from that mandate, those regulations then in a sense go to the equivalent appellate body. And as you can see from the table, there are no equivalent appellate bodies for the other two ministries here, which is why issues from those ministries straight away go to the Supreme Court, or well, first to the High Court and then to the Supreme Court. The idea, of course, to have these appellate tribunals is that A, they are more specialized, and B, it sort of blocks traffic going to the Supreme Court here. Okay, and all ministries are still not, in a sense, reached this stage of delineating appellate bodies here.
So also in like the first table, there was a Companies Act mentioned somewhere.
Yeah.
So I believe the Companies Act 1956 is no longer taken
2013 is the latest iteration. Yeah.
So what all are the differences between the two?
So again, I'm not a Companies Act specialist, but I know the fact that the loopholes which permit media companies to accumulate interest across different platforms, that loophole still exists here. So as far as I'm concerned, the Companies Act has not really changed for my limited purposes. Yeah. There are other things which might have been changed, but this idea of companies which mask their holding. Yeah. So for example, So it's called secondary ownership. So who owns the companies, who owns a company, who owns a company? That information perhaps is not as kind of discreetly brought out here. And that prevents actually calculating whether a company has interest in more than one field or not. Because it's possible that the mother company may not have it, but a subsidiary might have it, or a subsidiary might have it. But that then doesn't actually show up when we're talking about direct investment of. So for example, in your case, the number which you brought out, 75% is owned by, I don't know which one of you said that, yeah. The 75% is owned by person X here. But it's possible that the person X has another company, okay, which is 100% owned by that company, and that company itself has investment from company Y, yeah. Okay. So let's say, 75% is owned by the Sarkars, okay. That 75% actually stems from another company in which I own for 51%. So effectively, I own 37.5% in ABP. Yeah. Now, the Companies Act is not able to address this problem yeah, as to how does my investment in a subsidiary translate into my accumulation of interest in a particular kind of company, in the company in that particular field. Yeah. And if my company itself is owned by somebody else, say Reliance and whatever, Adani, together own my company 50% here, then the argument means that 25% of what he owns is actually coming from either Reliance or Adani. So that it's a kind of gray area, and that gray area actually has not really been addressed in the Companies Act on those statutes which are applicable to cross ownership here. So my knowledge is limited to the implications of the Altered Company Act as far as media ownership is concerned there. But there are other people who are, there are some people who are happy with the changes, some people who are a little bit more ambiguous here. But as far as I'm concerned, the implications of ownership has not changed, despite the 2013, the latest amendments at least.
So one last question.
Sure.
With that. So the IT Act of 2000,
yeah.
That was instituted like more than 2 decades, like almost 2 decades back. So
yeah.
Do you not believe that it requires amendments as well?
So there have been amendments, as you see on this table. There have been additions in 2008, 2011, and so on and so forth. I think there were some more recent amendments as well, but I don't think they had implications on news, so which is why they are not on this kind of map itself here. I think there is one amendment being discussed for next Parliament session, perhaps on the data stuff or something of that sort. Yeah. So I normally put the first year as to when the Act was introduced, because in India you have like a long chain of amendments. So I will just kind of grab the entire page. Yeah. So there would be multiple amendments in all of them. Yeah. So 2011 was the Intermediary Guideline amendments, which perhaps for me is the last one which impacts news from this particular thing.
I have a question, but it kind of goes back to a discussion which kind of Manu started about the proliferation of multiple channels.
Yeah.
Like even though we are saying big media companies are kind of dying away, and
yeah.
we are probably saying that. But if you can just kind of comment upon, so you said about news being an economic good these days, but then again, the economic good is also being, which is the better good to sell, is probably also dominated by the fact that you have multiple ideologies playing, and the same media house would have different outlets catering to different populace.
Yes.
So when you talk about say media power,
yeah.
How do you, like, if you have any comments to make on the fact that say the same News 18 is having Times Now, which is one polarity, and probably the other one which is Mirror Now as
yeah.
well. So of course we have been hearing about this economic angle, but if you can comment on, what makes into this making of newer broadcasters come into play, in order to what makes this newer broadcasting channels to come into play in order to cater to newer economies to attend to.
Oh yeah. So I mean, this goes by the whole idea of kind of niches in the market. So if there is a market for sort of pro Annapurna News, for instance, yeah, okay. And over a period of time, the broadcaster realized there is also a kind of a pro-Vibodh, a news which is pro-Vibodh. So the broadcaster then creates multiple platforms to address these different kind of niche audiences here. But that niche audience has to be remunerative enough to try and perhaps sustain that model. And again, the Times of India has managed that pretty well between Times Now and Mirror. So they're catering to different political leanings on those two different channels, yeah, okay. And that's kind of one way in which they addressed this issue here. But Times have always been very clear about the fact that they are not really, bias in a sense, Times works in a very different kind of way, and I don't think this is sort of, we don't have the time or the platform to talk about that, but this is one way in which a broadcasters tend to do this. Z also has been doing this here. In the early years, I think Z in Gujarat, I don't remember it very clearly, was pro-establishment and Calcutta was anti-establishment, or the other way around here. Okay? So this is quite common, whereby broadcasters, in a sense, in a particular language, they may be pro or anti-establishment. And the same broadcaster in a different language may perhaps be again, the other way around, anti or pro-establishment there. And that's largely because broadcasters are catering to different kind of audience markets here. And then in some cases, of course, you can have a further fragmentation of that, whereas one part of audience is being addressed in one language and one rhetoric, and the other part of the same audience in the same language is being addressed through another rhetoric. And this is, this is common kind of segmentation of markets, and this is, this is as good as old as marketing theory kind of thing, which is there. Can I just finish the last two slides?
Sir,
sorry, no, his hand, The social media policy part is what you had raised, and that's, I think, the last substantive slide, which is there before the summing up ones. Just the same. You have a question on?
Yes, yes. I have two questions. I mean, you talked about the fragmentation of the news regulation authorities.
The what?
Fragmentation of the different authorities.
Yes.
Because there is no single one board which can control the entire news circulation. So I'd like to address one question that is there no concern from the government side to form a authority which can control the entire situation, which can make the advocacy, level of advocacy much easier for us? And my second question is, the different types of ownership that we have discussed. So, have you ever seen in the, I am talking about the print journalism, because I am more associated with the digital journalism. I have seen different variation in the depicted of the single event. So, have you ever seen in print journalism that the ownership, when a newspaper is owned by company or politicians or family group, a single event is narrated in a different form in the writing styles or the narration? If yes, then can you give me some examples?
So again, I haven't looked at this closely, but it's not just also ownership, and just to make the question more complicated, it also changes with the editions of the same newspaper. I have a colleague, Professor Ravindran, he works in Madras University, and he had put together some preliminary kind of news clippings. It was about the story, I think, of a road accident. And, he had actually shown, he got this news stories based upon this incident or an accident somewhere in Tamil Nadu. And he showed the fact that different regional editions of the same newspaper frame the story differently. Okay, because they're appealing to different audiences. Okay, this is also common, for example, in typically it's most visible in kind of border states skirmishes. So there's a skirmish, for example, on the border of Karnataka and Maharashtra. The language issue keeps coming up again in Belgaum and Dharwad and so on and so forth. There, of course, is a classic case where the same story actually tends to take a different kind of spin. This is quite common. Even the BBC does this. So it's not something which is unique to what happens in India. But I think this whole idea of different editions doing it gave it a more interesting kind of spin about how these issues are actually framed. But the whole idea, in a sense, the absolutist idea of free speech actually provides legitimacy for this, that each entity can actually frame things in terms of their own perspectives. Of course, as long as those incidences are accurate. Yeah. And I think the accuracy part is something which where there is a question mark which comes in. Yeah. Just to wrap up the last part, we did the same thing with cable, the same thing I'm going to do with online news. So on the left-hand side, there are kind of issues which sort of challenges to the online news business, again, accumulation of interests. And I use the word path dependencies. This comes, the phrase path dependencies, just to introduce that. It comes from regulatory theory. The argument there is that if there is a certain regulatory framework which has been created at a point of time in the past, that then reproduces itself in the future. Yeah. So just because we didn't have caps on the market share of newspapers in the 50s and 60s, therefore we don't have caps consequently on the market share of television in the 90s. And therefore again we don't have caps on the market share of online in the 2000s. Yeah. So there are sort of paths through which regulation gets stuck, and it's very difficult to break out of this path. Yeah. The search issue is important. There is a high concentration in search markets, and we can try and test that out by a show of hands in this room. How many of you use a search engine other than Google? Oh, more than I thought. Which ones? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Anything else? Sorry? Tak. Okay, that's like last 2 years. Yeah. Sorry? Baidu, you use Baidu? Okay, no, but anybody who regularly uses a non-Google search engine? Yeah. Okay, Yahoo. Okay, so that's the sort of recent entrance. Anybody else? Before DuckDuckGo, what were you using? Yeah. And before DuckDuckGo, what were you using? Google. You still use Google, okay, yeah. Sorry? Yeah. So, I mean, this is also, in a sense, this room itself shows the fact that in the market of search, which as we know enables the discovery of news online, there is effectively a monopoly here. Okay? And as I had sort of mentioned in the passing earlier, what is interesting about Google is that not only is Google a search engine, a way to discover news, but Google also functions as an advertising agency, which means that the relationship between news outlets and Google is that similar to that between a advertising agency who gets in ads, who gets in people who want to invest in advertisements, and a news producer. Yeah. So the kind of hold over Google over the news business in India is particularly strong, perhaps even more stronger than in other parts of the world. Yeah. And this is, of course, something which is definitely going to be an object of regulation in the next 2 years. The European Union is already addressing this, and I think things might change here as well in the next couple of years. Yeah. The point I want to address a little bit more here is what I call platform opacity. The last point here, we talked about what a platform is in the last, I sort of clarified that. Yeah. Okay, so platforms essentially are these kind of digital malls. Okay, they accumulate a large number of service functions within one kind of entity. And the way in which these platforms behave with news producers is something which is completely opaque here. Okay, and things are more or less conveniently blamed on the abstract idea of an algorithm here. Okay, so the argument is that it's not that the platforms are biased themselves, but the algorithm, so-called, is actually perhaps driving news and audiences in a particular kind of direction and so on and so forth. But of course, the algorithm is also human-made, and therefore there are issues there as well. Yeah. The relationship between revenues shared by platforms and news organizations is also not transparent here. So, for example, if you get an ad, you have a website A for a news site, and you have an ad of, let's say, whatever, the pen on that. Yeah, okay, and then news website B, which you also have an ad, of the same pen. Assuming you are comparable websites in terms of traffic, it's possible that one of you might get a better deal from Google than the other one. Okay? But the point here, of course, is that what is the nature of that deal is not really transparent. In most cases in newspapers, it's relatively more transparent. You know if you want to put out an ad in the Hindustan Times and you want it to be 5 inches by 6 inches, you have some idea of how much you have to pay. If you have to put out an ad on television, you know 30 seconds costs roughly so much. You don't have that kind of effective tools as far as the internet is concerned, because you have a very dominant intermediary, which is sort of managing the entire kind of value chain. Essentially, what is and this is the kind of argument which I am making at the end of this, is the fact that we have a scenario in the Indian regulatory framework where speech as the object of regulation is over-regulated, whereas the infrastructure is something which is highly under-regulated. If you divide all the kind of stuff, if you go back later on and so on and so forth. So, for example, here, all the 4 regulatory challenges, they deal with infrastructure, and none of them, in a sense, have some sort of a very clear and effective regulatory addressal. Same if we try and go back for this as well, we'll see that, all of them in this case as well are infrastructure issues. So, the news as a business, news as an infrastructure is something which is highly under-regulated if you compare this with other countries. Whereas news as a form of speech, online speech or other forms of speech, is something which is highly over-regulated, and of course most frequently regulated as well, as you see with the case of internet shutdowns, blockage, cases of libel against news organizations and so on and so forth. So this is quite a unique situation, that one part of the of news is over-regulated with very strong compliance, and the other part of news is under-regulated with very low level of compliance. And this is again pretty unique as far as the global markets are concerned. The last set of slides, again conceptually coming back and sort of explaining why I am thinking of this title which I gave, which I kind of held back towards the end. And that's largely because the claim I'm making is the fact that although we are dealing with digital technology, the way regulation is designed is still very much in the analog mode. And what do I mean by analog mode? So analog thinking effectively means 4 or 5 things. It means essentially that technology provides the unidirectional flow of information. Information moves from one to the other. From newspapers, from the printing press to your doorstep, or the broadcaster from the broadcaster station to your TV sets, which is of course different in digital. In the value chain, in a sense, those actors which are connected in the analog sphere, there's a very clear separation between those who are producers, those who are distributors, those who are resellers, and so on and so forth. So there is a clear separation in the value chain. In the analog era, one also saw a very well-defined jurisdiction, which means state regulation was limited to the jurisdiction of that particular political geography. The primary actors in the analog era were essentially the government ministries. So it was very state-centric, top-heavy regulation. And the regulatory approach was based upon the idea of harms. This goes back to sort of 19th century kind of political philosophy, where the idea was that unless a clear harm is shown, there should not be a regulatory intervention. Okay? And this contrasts with the scenario later on, because the digital milieu then has changed the conditions where analog thinking was operating. And what is this digital milieu? There is tremendous movement, as we all know, and this would have been, I guess, addressed in different lectures over the last 2 weeks. It's not only virality is not only about movement or speed, but it's also about space, how things move across geographies, and therefore move across jurisdictions. And therefore, jurisdiction is no longer bound to national sovereignty. The digital milieu also has tremendous amount of volume, and by volume I don't mean just quantity of information flowing, but also in terms of different kind of formats. So if you want to send an encrypted message from person A to person B, you have at least half a dozen sort of apps which can send an encrypted message here. Okay, it's not just WhatsApp for that matter. Yeah, and of course there's also volume in terms of a large number of actors available there. The digital sort of milieu also brings this whole idea of visibility, and this is something which I had talked in the beginning, that it's possible to try and perhaps trace each one of those entities. So you know where the signal is coming from, where did it go, and so on and so forth. Okay, and therefore, in a sense, encryption becomes an important systemic part of it. It is not that encryption was not there before the coming of digital systems. I mean, the history of encryption is at least about 2,000 years old. But then the way encryption works in digital systems is, of course, completely new. And the last part of the digital milieu, of course, is the velocity. And by velocity, I mean the pace of change. Yeah. The pace of change of companies and the pace of change of technology. Yeah. As you were saying, companies constantly die and new companies coming up. Technologies constantly die and new kind of things coming up. Yeah. And therefore, we have a scenario whereby we understand the limits of analog thinking. Yeah. So the digital milieu has therefore provided limits to the analog thinking. Yeah. And if you compare the table on the top with the table at the bottom, we see that technology, in a sense, is not unidirectional, it's kind of polydirectional. We have kind of multiple formats of each kind of thing, The value chain is highly overlapping here. So the sharp distinction between producers and distributors and agencies, those sharp distinctions have more or less kind of got very fuzzy here. Jurisdiction is supranational, which means that on many aspects the state does not have jurisdiction because companies are spread across the world, signals are flowing across the world, and this of course has led to a call for sort of global governance as far as digital milieu is concerned there. In terms of actors, as we saw in our various tables here, besides the ministries, there are other bodies also involved in the context of regulation. Okay, private bodies, public bodies, trade bodies, individual firms, and so on and so forth. And in the digital milieu, therefore, I think there has been this strong argument of moving away from the normative basis of harms to the idea of risk. So the argument here is that things are moving perhaps so fast in the digital milieu that there could be a case to try and do regulation based upon the assessment of risk, rather than wait to show that something causes harm and then go back and regulate it. Yeah. So the whole harms versus risk approach towards regulation, this has its own sort of history in law, it has its own history in regulation. This perhaps is the kind of biggest sort of debate which is there at the level of regulatory theory. Yeah. And those who continue to argue for harms-based regulation, which means you have to show that there has been a negative impact on society, on individuals, before which regulation cannot happen. Yeah. And that's something which is quite a precarious scenario, because you're then trying to show that, there has to be an earthquake that destroys buildings, only after which you make sort of better buildings. Yeah. I mean, that's the kind of argument which is there, yeah, as opposed to a risk-based approach. And there's been a lot of work on risk in other areas being done, environmental risks, water, and so on and so forth. But risk is an area which has not really been addressed in media policy. Yeah. Just the last sort of set of conclusions, I've been sort of addressed this at different points of time. Yeah. Through these various regulations, you would be seeing examples of regulation which are based on strategic intent, like the Colonial Code. All speech regulation is based on intent. You also have this whole idea of kind of sledgehammer approach. So, for example, for example, if there is false news circulating and you shut down the internet to try and prevent the circulation of false news, quite clearly in that process you're also shutting down or limiting the activities of business, which is also using the internet. Yeah. So that kind of sledgehammer approach towards false news is something which has more or less reached its limits as of now. Yeah. Point number 3 about regulatory instruments, and this is something, a bit of a worrying scenario where more and more regulatory interventions is happening by bypassing the parliament. Yeah. And this has been a feature over the last sort of 15 years at least. Yeah. Okay, so more regulation is happening through executive orders rather than through and the ordinance route. rather than through legislation. Yeah. The fragmented regulatory architecture, we talked about that in detail. It leads to sort of turf wars. Fragmentation also leads to what's called regulatory capture. And we essentially see a complete disempowerment of both the principal regulators, the press regulator and the communication regulator. Yeah. And there are, of course, examples throughout the various slides about what I called in the beginning regulatory silences, which means there is a challenge to a regulation, but there is no regulation in response to that. Yeah. And when these silences sort of accumulate over a period of time, one tries and perhaps questions whether these silences are because of lack of ability, or is there something more insidious behind these silences there? And that, in a sense, changes the way in which we understand regulation completely. Yeah. And I'm through. Thanks very much for this. 6 minutes over.